I'd like to call to order the August 29th meeting of the Montecito Planning Commission. Can you all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Jessica Oplin, you want to do the TV coverage announcement for us, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Montecito Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County of Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orca areas. Rebroadcast of Montecito Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 o'clock p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. And for the roll call, Commissioner Godstanker? Here. Commissioner Overall? Here. Commissioner Burrows? Here. Commissioner Phillips? Here. And Commissioner Bierig.
Here.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. It seems like it's been months, and it literally has been months.
It
since I've been
almost
with
has
you.
been 2 months, I believe.
Well, I haven't been with your commission since May because I missed your June meeting, and July's was canceled. So it's nice to be back with you this morning. The agenda this morning is uncharacteristically light. We have 2 items. One is a permit item, and the second is a briefing that your commission requested in June on the Resource Management Zone District. And the staff has put together, I think, a pretty comprehensive overview of the Resource Management Zone District and its relationship to the Montecito Community Plan and the architectural guidelines. So we'll go over that this morning and entertain any questions or comments that your commission may have. And I believe Tony Spann, at least, and maybe Marcia Ziles will be here this morning for that discussion as well. So we're ready to move forward with both items.
Excellent. I see. Did you have more on that? Or, agenda?
Nothing more on the status report. I can move into the projection report.
Would
if
you
you'd like.
please?
Sure.
It looks like we're pretty light here as well.
Your commission will be meeting next week in joint session with the County Planning Commission to have a briefing on the housing element implementation phase and also to receive a report on the general plan. It's our annual report that we submit to the state. So that'll occur next week, be the first 2 items on the agenda, and hopefully we'll have you out of here before noon.
I do have a question on that. If we
Yes.
have specific questions that we'd like to have addressed, would it be advisable to submit those in advance?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Overall, always helpful.
Okay.
Because then the staff can be sure to be
Who-
prepared.
Who should they be addressed to?
If they're on the housing element, actually, if they're on either of the items, it would be David Mattson
Okay.
in comprehensive planning, long-range planning. Okay, so moving on to September 19th. This agenda also looks quite light. You've got one CUP and variance item on. However, a couple of the planning commissioners did talk to me about having the Miramar on your agenda for conceptual review, or alternatively having you attend the Montecito BAR meeting on the 10th. And after giving that some thought and talking to the applicant for the Miramar project, we have arranged to have a conceptual review with the Planning Commission on September 19th. So that item will be on that day as well. I think that's a more productive approach than having the commission try to attend jointly the Montecito BAR meeting on the 10th, because there hasn't been a substantial amount of work done yet at the BAR. So I think the BAR really could use that hearing absent the commission's considerations as well, and then they can join you on the 19th, and you can have a joint discussion of the project. So that seems
Would you like us to
acceptable.
have some discussion on that point and to make
that
sure
would-
there's a consensus? Should
that'd
we
be-
do that now?
Sure. Great.
Okay. Commissioner Gotstinger.
I just had a question of staff. Will we receive, prior to that conceptual hearing, the packet of material?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Gottstinker, that's a very good question. We will be providing the commission with plans and we won't give you every plan sheet they have because it's an overwhelming package. Julie Harris is going through those plans now to try and figure out which would be the best plans for the commission to have, in addition to basic site plan, a basic landscape plan, basic grading plan, but we want you to have some elevations and other documents that might help you in your review. And then we'll be preparing a pretty short memo just highlighting issues that we're looking at. We're not intending for the commission to reach consensus about the project. We're just really looking for individual comments. So the level of analysis will be much, much less than you would get at the end of a project review. So this would be a brief memo highlighting some issues that we're looking into as well as the plans.
And the base documents is
Right.
what we're really looking at.
Right.
Mr. Allen, did you have a comment for us?
Mr. Chair, thank you, members of the commission. I just wanted to emphasize what Ms. Black just mentioned. A conceptual review, under our rules, is a review whereby all that is obtained from the commissioners are individual comments. So I think it's important that the public understand that it is truly conceptual, that no consensus will be developed, that you will simply be polled individually for any comments that you think might be useful or appropriate at a very conceptual stage of the process.
Thank you. Commissioner Gottstenger, I assume from your comment that you're in favor of having this, adding this item to our agenda. Is that correct?
Yes, I think I was one of the commissioners that actually requested it.
Right. I just wanted to make sure in our comments here that we were in consensus that that's a good idea to put this item on our, and I'll, Commissioner, overall, I see you have your light on there.
I will not be at the meeting on the 19th. I have attended a couple of the community meetings, and I attended the last MBAR meeting. And I have some, obviously I don't know what's happened from then to now or will have happened by the 19th, but I do have some items that, that I'm interested in, some thoughts. What would be an appropriate way to communicate that to the, if at all, to the other commissioners? Just things I would look at, be interested in.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Overall, perhaps the best way is just to communicate those to me, and then on the 19th, I can make sure that the
Okay.
commission is aware of those.
Do that.
Commissioner Phillips?
Mr. Chair, thank you. I'm certainly not opposed to the conceptual hearing, but I don't, how is it that a planning commission provides concept comments? I don't see how that works. I thought things came here after some certainty was formed at least the MBAR level.
Director Black, I'm glad to see you want to address this. So.
Sure. Mr. Chair and Commissioner Phillips, it's a very good question. This is a relatively new process for the county. It's something that both the County Planning Commission and the Montecito Planning Commission put into the procedures maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. It was something that the members of the development community really thought was a useful tool in other jurisdictions. City of Santa Barbara actually came to meet with some of the county planning commissioners to talk about how it works in their jurisdiction. It's really intended to be an opportunity for individual comments by the Planning Commission to be made to the developer. So you're not supposed to, nor will we allow you to reach consensus on the project. It's really to give individual comments so that the developer can take those comments and use them in whatever way they think. It's also an opportunity for the public to give some early input into the project for the developer's benefit. So it's very early in the process. It is before substantial analysis is done either by staff or even the MBAR, and it's intended to be that.
Is there reliance by the developer as to comments we might make?
Well, whether there is or not, there isn't supposed to be. So you're not bound by your comments. Your comments are based upon, the project at that stage, very early before you've gotten this additional analysis, which could change your analysis of the project.
Yes.
Mr. Allen?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Phillips and members of the commission. In fact, council usually makes a statement to that effect at the beginning of the hearing to make it very clear to applicant representatives and the public that you are not bound to comments that you make at a very early conceptual stage of the project. So,
I'm going to throw out my own comment just from having been on the other side, on the developer side of the process. And I find as a developer, it's extremely useful to get the comments ahead of time, because it gives you an opportunity, if you're bringing a project forward, to see what's the general level of comments about it. And sometimes you discover that something you think might be problematic turns out to be pretty well received, and vice versa, something you think is simple. And I think it makes the process much more efficient and will prevent us from, in this project, it'll give us the best chance to process this thing through the system in a way that will make everybody achieve the best result and get us there in the shortest amount of time.
Yeah, that was the context from which I was coming from when I asked staff if we could do this, because I know there's a request by the applicant to move this through the process as quickly as possible, and I felt that it was to the applicant's benefit to bring it forward so that at least the applicant knew what we were looking at, given that the applicant has had a number of community reviews and has gone to MBAR at least once, that in my experience on this commission in the past with other large projects, as I voiced at one of those public hearings, it appears to me that there's this sort of ping pong thing that happens between MBAR and the MPC, where MBAR can't really deal with some of the land use issues, and yet they have to make some decisions based on the project that they have in front of them, and then it comes to us and we make land use decisions, then we send it back to them, then they do what they do. I mean, in the Music Academy, we went back and forth. I don't know how many times this commission went back and forth. I was on MBAR at the time, so I was on that end, and it just, as Chairman Barrick said, it just seems like when we have very large projects like this, to get us both commissions up front on the table with what the issues are as early as possible is to the benefit of the applicant. And that's where I was looking from when I requested this joint meeting.
Well, it sounds like we generally have a consensus on this, so I think it's a good idea if we do have this on the agenda for our September meeting. Looks like October is looking delightfully light as well.
October is open so far, Mr. Chair. And just a note on your November meeting. That meeting is scheduled for November 29th, which is a Thursday. So I just wanted to make sure that the commissioners had that marked on their calendars. The question actually came up, it would normally fall on the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving, and we had already adjusted the calendar for that, but I'd even forgotten that. So
Good.
the commission could just make a note. Thursday, November 29th would be the November Montecito Planning
Okay.
Commission meeting.
Good. I want to mention, I think I had indicated in one of our previous meetings that I would not be here for the October meeting, but I will in fact be in town through that Friday, so I can make that date, assuming we have that date. Is that the conclude the projection report?
Mr. Chair, that's all I had this morning on the projection report.
Great. And Director Black, are you going to handle the director's report?
Yes, I will. Mr. Baker is conducting interviews for the Public Works Director, so
Okay.
he won't be able to be here this morning. Just a few items. The board's been fairly light as well. They took 3 weeks, I think, off in August, and so there isn't a lot to report in terms of board action. But I did want to mention 2 items that were at the board on appeal from your commission, and one is the Franklin appeal. That's the Franklin Veterinary Clinic, and that item has yet to be actually heard by the Board of Supervisors. I believe it's continued until October or November at this point. I'll let you know when it's getting close to coming up. The other is the Fraser Siemens matter that your commission voted on, and it was appealed by both the applicant and interested neighbors, and both appeals were dropped. So the Board of Supervisors did not have to hear that item, and the commission's action stood. An item that will be going to the board at the end of September, on September 25th, is an update report on the department's process improvement efforts, and I will provide you with a copy of the staff report at your regular September meeting and highlight some of the issues that'll be coming up at the board. That was at the request of Supervisor Carbajal and Supervisor Wolf, so we'll be updating them, and I thought it would be good for you to see that. County Planning Commission requested organizational charts for the department, and I thought I would provide those to your commission as well, just so you understood kind of how we're structured and who you might call if you have particular questions or concerns. So I'll have Jessica pass those out. Before we did leave the Miramar, but going back to the Miramar, I wanted to let the commission know that story poles are being erected for the Montecito BAR meeting on September 10th. So those will be available for viewing starting on September 10th. If the commission wants to try and go out there while the story poles are up, I think that would be useful. We'll try and get you a key to those story poles so it'll be easier for you to interpret what you're seeing in the field. And my recommendation is the earlier you go out there, the better condition those story poles will be in. But they'll probably be up for about 2 weeks. But they tend to start sagging and drooping after a bit, so you may want to get out there early. And then finally, I don't know if the entire commission was informed of recent resignation, but Cynthia Mendoza has resigned as the Planning Commission recording secretary for the department, and she will be missed, and I just wanted to let you know. And we do have other very competent staff, including Jessica Opland, and so you'll be seeing more of them and less of her, obviously. So.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. She was kind enough to call me, and I saw she sent out an email as well. It's going to be a shame to. She's just been a fixture for us. It's going to be hard to see that change. And I know you, staff, you guys have worked together for so many years, so much more tenure. But sounds like she's moving on to great new things. So it's wonderful. But thank you for mentioning that.
I think that's all I had to report, unless there are questions.
Okay. If not, it's now the time for public comment. I'm not sure if we have any speaker slips. But even if we don't, if there's anybody here who wishes to address us on an item that's not on our agenda, now would be the time to do so. Not seeing anyone, I'll close the time for public comment and move on to the Planning Commissioner's informational reports. And Commissioner Gottstenger, I'll start with you. Do you have anything to report during since our last meeting?
I did attend the Montecito Association Board of Directors meeting in which they had a presentation of the Miramar by Mr. Caruso and team. I think that's and then I did also attend the MBAR hearing. I don't remember the date when they were doing both Ligura and the Miramar. Those were the two meetings I went to.
Thank you. Commissioner Overall?
I also attended the MBAR meeting in which the Ligura and Miramar were reviewed. And I attended on behalf of the commission, the right-of-way committee, subcommittee that is continuing to develop some materials. We have another meeting this week, and when there's something more definitive to share, either somebody else or I will pass it along to you. But we're making progress.
Excellent. Commissioner Burrows?
No report.
Commissioner Phillips?
No report.
And no report here either. Let's see, what do we got here next? Planning and Development Divisional briefings.
Mr. Chair, actually, there are no divisional briefings this morning, but I did forget to make one other announcement. Perhaps most of the commissioners already know, but the County Planning Commission, Commissioner Smizer resigned. He sits for Supervisor Firestone, and Supervisor Firestone has appointed C.J. Jackson as his new 3rd District Planning Commissioner, so I thought you would want to know that as well.
Thank you for mentioning that. It looks like it's time for the minutes. I don't know if anybody has any comments or changes to our minutes from our meeting of June 20th. We did not have a July meeting. And if there are none, I would love to entertain a motion for the approval of those minutes.
So moved. Are there any-
I'll second that.
Oh,
Motion and second for the approval of the minutes of June 20th. All in favor, aye. Opposed, no. Aye.
Please let the record say, show, excuse me, that I abstained since I did not deliberate or consider item 4.
Very well, thank you. So, moving right along here, we're into our standard agenda, and item number 1 is the Nadell Single Family Addition at 1127 Hill Road. And Jessica, can you read that item into the agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on the request of Jeff Nadell to consider case number 07-CDH-18, application filed on June 6, 2007 for a coastal development permit, and to accept the exemption pursuant to sections 15301, 14, and 15303E of the state guidelines for implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act.
Thank you. Mr. Ward, you're making the presentation on this item, is that correct? Staff? Yes, okay, thank you.
Yes, I think he's a little busy pulling up his presentation, but yes, Mr. Ritterbeck will make the presentation this morning.
So we're ready for your presentation. I think given how we've reordered we'll do the site visit oral evidence. We've moved that after the staff presentation in our order of evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Jay Ritterbeck. I'm the planner for the Nadell Single Family Dwelling Addition Project. This project is located on Hill Road, south of Highway 101, north of Butterfly Beach, and situated between the Biltmore to the east and Music Academy to the west. The project site is located at 1127 Hill Road. Property is a 1-acre parcel zoned 1E1, single-family urban residential. Existing development includes the following: a 5,435 square foot single-family dwelling currently under construction and part of a demo rebuild permit approved on May 17, 2007, a 768 square foot guest house, and a 798 square foot cabana and pool. Both of these were approved and constructed in 2001. Following the approval of the demo rebuild permit, the property owner submitted a new application to allow construction of a 544 square foot covered patio on the southern side of the new home facing the ocean. The reason this addition is before the Commission today is because the proposed project extends into the California Coastal Commission's appeals jurisdiction, requiring a public hearing. Next, I'll be showing the Commission a closer view of the proposed project site plan and elevations. The approved single-family dwelling currently under construction is located entirely outside of the appeals jurisdiction of the California Coastal Commission. The previously approved CDP for the demo rebuild included construction of a 236 square foot covered patio, which is proposed to be removed as a component of this project before the Commission today. A new 544 square foot covered patio would replace the previously approved patio and extend approximately 10 feet into the appeals jurisdiction. The new covered patio has been designed in the same style as the previously approved single-family dwelling, which was also subject to MBAR design review and received final MBR approval. The proposed covered patio received conceptual review from MBAR on July 16, 2007, where MBAR made the following comments. The proposed porch is acceptable, and there are no concerns from MBAR. On staff's analysis, the project is consistent with all applicable comprehensive plan policies and the Montecito Community Plan policies. Project is also in compliance with all applicable requirements of Article 2 Coastal Zoning Ordinance 1E1 Zone District, subject to approval of the requested coastal development permit. When reviewing all applicable planning policies, staff believe the neighborhood compatibility policies were the most applicable to the proposed project. Specifically, Visual Resource Policy Number 3, Montecito Community Plan Policy Viz M 1.3, and Coastal Plan Policy 3-14. Staff believes the project to be consistent with these policies and is able to recommend approval. Also, on July 16, 2007, MBAR commented that there were no concerns or issues related to scale, design, or character, views, or appropriateness of the proposed project. And prior to the CDP issuance of the permit, that will require final approval from the MBAR. Staff recommends the Commission adopt the required findings for the project as specified in Attachment A, accept the CEQA exemption as specified in Attachment B, and approve 07 CDH 18 subject to conditions of approval in Attachment C. This concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you very much. I'll move on to the commissioners regarding site visits and ex parte communications. Does anybody, who would like to start? It's a small item here.
Right, I did drive by the site, and I had no ex parte communications.
Commissioner Burrows.
I visited the site.
Commissioner Phillips.
I did as well.
Commissioner Overall.
Nothing to report.
Yeah, I also visited the site, and no ex parte communications. Does the applicant wish to?
Chairman,
Yeah.
I was not on site, but I was on the street and had a sense of the neighbor confines, and so I think we've been on this site before, though, weren't
Right. We saw this item
Years
not long
ago?
Yes.
we? Yeah.
And I've physically been on this site before. The appropriate time for the applicant to make a presentation, if they wish.
I believe, my name is John Watson, I'm the architect for the project. I believe that staff has completely understood the project and it's presented it as comprehensively as it needs to be. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but I have nothing further to add.
Thank you. I don't see any questions, so thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Now would be the appropriate time for any members of the public that wish to address us on this item. I don't see any speaker slips, so I'm going to close the time for public comment. And unless, I guess it's back to us. Any comment, or somebody want to make a motion?
Would you like a motion?
Please do.
I move that we accept the staff recommendation.
You're moving the staff recommendation. Thank you.
I second the motion.
Motion and second for approval of the staff recommendation. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Aye. Thank you. And moving on to what I think is going to be our more interesting item today is the RMZ Zone District briefing, which has come up relative to a few projects and may even tie into our presentation next year, or next week, related to the land use element of the county plan. So I'm ready if you want to read that one into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Montecito Planning Commission will receive a briefing on the Resource Management Zone RMZ District, including the purpose and intent of the district, how the Montecito architectural guidelines and development standards relate to development in RMZ, development that has occurred since RMZ was created, and feedback from the members of the Montecito Board of Architectural Review.
Thank you. Director Black?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if we could just take a few minutes so the staff that are going to be presenting this item can set up, that'd be really helpful.
Great, thank you. We'll take a 5-minute recess.
Perfect.
For item number 2, the RMZ Zone District briefing. And back to staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. As I indicated a little earlier during my review of the agenda today, your commission asked for this briefing at your hearing in June, and June Peugeot and Noel Engel are here today to go over the resource management zone issues that you asked us to look into or to brief you on. Tony Spann and Marcia Ziles are also present. I think Marcia has a PowerPoint presentation that she'd like to give to the Planning Commission, and then it's really just a discussion item with the members of the Planning Commission and the 2 BAR representatives. So we'll go ahead. We've got probably at least a 20-minute presentation to go through the material, and then perhaps you'll want to turn it over to Marcia and Tony, and then we can go into discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm June Peugeot. I work in Development Review. And Noel Engel and I are going to share the presentation on the briefing on the Resource Management Zone District. I am going to be providing you with some of the background of the zoning and the land use designations in the higher elevations of the Montecito Community Plan area, primarily because I was the project manager for the Montecito Community Plan back in those days. So I'll be giving you some background on that, and then Noel is going to be giving you some information on the current zoning standards in the Hillside Overlay District, and some information from the architectural guidelines in general. So in terms of background, I'm first going to go over the mountainous area land use designations, and then I'll give you a little bit of information on the current status on build out on some of those parcels, and then how the idea and the concept of the hillside overlay and the architectural guidelines was actually generated, the history of how that developed. This first map that you see is the actual adopted land use designation map for the upper area of the Montecito Community Plan. It's a scanned version. It's the map that was adopted along with the Montecito Community Plan in 1992, but it shows the current land use designations for this area. This is the currently adopted. I don't know if you can see some of the titles on there, but you'll see MA written all the way across, because that's the land use designations. There are some 40-acre minimum parcel sizes and 100, and there might be a sprinkling of 320 minimum parcel size in there as well. Everything you see on this map, do we have a laser here? Okay, well, maybe I can just use the arrow. But if you see this sort of darker stepped line coming down through the bottom of the map, that's basically the urban-rural boundary line for the Montecito Community Plan area. So everything north of there that's inside the community plan has a land use designation of mountainous area. The mountain area land use designation provides a very good match for the resource management zone district. So that's a separate zoning map that we'll see in a minute, but most of the properties, actually all the properties now in this area, are also zoned resource management zone district to match. This is a map that our graphics division pulled together for us for today's briefing. And it gives a little bit better graphic presentation of this same area. And it shows the mountainous area designation, but in this case, it's showing you parcel ownership. So the names of the owners are actually printed on this map if you look closely there. The green parcels are vacant parcels in the area. The red ones have some approved or built development on them. The dash line, which again is this kind of stepped line that follows down here, is the urban-rural boundary line. And then slightly below that line, you'll also see the edge, particularly in this place where it's not coterminous. You'll see the edge of the Hillside Zoning Overlay District. So one of the things this shows you is the hillside overlay is the rural area plus a little strip of properties below the urban-rural boundary line in the Montecito area. The designation of mountainous area for the Montecito area is the same as the designation and descriptions of mountainous area elsewhere in the county. So what those areas are defined to be are rural, predominantly really steeply sloped properties, 40% or greater in many cases, but it also includes the tablelands that are included within those sloped areas. It's typically extensively covered with chaparral and other dense vegetation. It's typically watershed areas and has high visual effect for the surrounding communities. As you know, the mountainous area in Montecito is seen as a backdrop to the community. And oftentimes there are very minimal services in this area. Like, for example, the sewer lines, mains are usually south of this kind of an area, and that's the case in Montecito. The mountainous areas are meant to be free of intensive development. That's the intent of the mountainous area designation, but it also allows low-density residential uses. And that's a key point here in that the mountainous area designation is a very low-intensity one. There's only one other land use designation that has an intent of maintaining it in more pristine condition than the mountainous area, and that's the other open lands designation. We don't have that in Montecito. But regardless of whether it's mountainous area or other open lands, all these designations allow at least a single-family residence on each of the parcels. So no matter how low intensity it's meant to be, it still allows a house. What this is actually, in the right side, a scanned version of the actual documents that were used in 1991 when we came up with the basis for making land use changes in the Montecito Community Plan. So this was immediately preceding the adoption of the community plan. Commissioner Gottstenger might remember some of this. But when we initiated the community plan, we actually came up with our criteria for how to redesignate land and rezone land in the Montecito area. When it came to this mountainous area, we produced some documents and presented them to the Planning Commission and to the Board of Supervisors for their review in recommending our changes. And this is the actual document that we used from those old files. And it's hard to see in the scanned version, but basically what it says is our basis for making changes in the mountainous area and increasing parcel sizes and changing properties to mountainous area designation from other designations was because of reduced firefighting capability and the high fire hazard area, constrained road geometrics, as we had mentioned before, the steep slopes in the watershed areas, the dense vegetation, also protection of open land characteristics and mountain backdrop as a community and regional asset. So that was our reasoning in making some of the changes at that time. How we actually converted properties was done like this. We moved the urban-rural boundary line to the south, so we captured more properties into the rural area than there had previously been. So prior to 1992, the line for the urban-rural boundary was a little bit further to the north than where it is today. And as you'll probably recall, any properties in a rural area boundary automatically have a minimum parcel size of 40 acres per parcel. All of these new rural area properties were given mountainous area designation. Some already had it, but what we did was we went through and we reduced the density of development in the mountainous area by increasing the parcel sizes. So if there was a mountainous area parcel that was previously designated with a 40-acre minimum, but for example, it was a 100-acre parcel, we changed the designation from mountainous area 40 to mountainous area 100 to better match the existing parcel sizes. And then for that new area that now was brought into the rural category, there were several residential .3 parcels, which is a 3-acre minimum parcel. Those all changed to mountainous area and became non-conforming as to parcel size, but they got the mountainous area and then the resource management zone district rather than the residential zone district applied to them. This is one of the old maps. Again, it was from the initiation of the community plan, and it shows the existing at that time, so the pre-1992 rural area line, and then it shows how it shifted to the south. Interestingly enough, when we initiated the community plan, we also at that time had a concept and a rough idea of the creation of a hillside overlay district. And so although it wasn't adopted with the community plan, we had demonstrated the intent of creating a hillside district somewhat in this area, even further south than the new urban-rural boundary line. And that was presented to the decision makers at that time. Again, this is an old map from the initiation of that plan. And if you compared that map from 1991, that draft map, to today's map, and you followed these lines of the urban-rural boundary line and the current hillside line at the bottom, you'd find they pretty closely match. The major difference really between the two was going through parcel by parcel and making sure we were following parcel boundary lines. In the prior map, we didn't. You can obviously see a difference between 1991 and now in our graphic capability. That was part of it too. This chart shows you the current status of those properties today in terms of development. On the map that showed the green properties for undeveloped and the red properties for approved or developed sites, you'll see that the red areas basically constitute 51 total parcels in the rural area. Only one of those is public. The rest were private development, which makes some sense because typically that's where you would see the development occur. And conversely, there are 63 undeveloped private properties and 41 undeveloped public properties. Public meaning owned by the USA or the state of California, that sort of thing. Totaling 155 parcels in that entire rural area. And then just to segue into some of the information that Noel is going to be giving you now, the 1991 plan initiation for the community plan and the adopted plan both included actually several what we call action items. So these weren't the policies that became immediately effective. These were basically directions for future implementation items. And they're called action items. And those action items, several of them repeated more or less the same wording as this one does, asking for development standards for hillside areas. And there are other action items included in here that actually drove the work on the architectural guidelines as well. So the concept was built into the Montecito Community Plan. The implementation followed later after that work item was done with the 1995 adoption of the overlay for the hillside area and the architectural guidelines, which were done at the same time. So that's the historical perspective on this area of the Montecito Community Plan. And now I think Noel is going to give you some information on the standards of both the Hillside Overlay District and the architectural guidelines.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Puzo, what is the interest in the city of Santa Barbara's ownership? Why would they be owning property within the Montecito area? I think the U.S. government is Forest Service land, I'm sure. But and then secondly, what happens should we have an issue there? Is that the City Planning Commission handles that matter, or so we have jurisdiction over city property?
It's really very typical to have all sorts of government agencies holding real property, just like the county holds real property. And time to time you see those come forward either for development or for exchange purposes and whatnot. So every level of government and every type of agency holds certain properties. The city of Santa Barbara could hold it for public service reasons, like future requirements, say for water or watershed or reservoirs or that sort of thing. Could be a variety of reasons. The USA properties could be forest properties, but it's not an area designation, it's an actual property ownership of the USA, which is slightly different from saying that it's in the Forest Service. Several of these properties are within the Forest Service boundaries, but as you probably know, we have many private holdings inside the Forest Service boundaries, and those private lands are subject to county jurisdiction and permits. What the jurisdiction is for review of any development on those government-held properties really has to do with which entity owns it and whether in the hierarchy there is our ability to permit or not based on, for example, a USA government property we would not be able to issue permits on because they would have more preeminent powers over local government. But for the city of Santa Barbara, since the county is higher in structure, it's possible that we would be looped into their review. Although our zoning ordinances do exempt some certain public projects from having to get permits. But there's a hierarchy built into those.
We don't have jurisdiction over Coast Village Road because it's city property.
Yeah, that's within the city jurisdiction.
But this city of Santa Barbara
Right.
property
Right.
doesn't preclude our involvement.
This is, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Phillips, this is a different situation. The Coast Village Road is within the incorporated boundaries of the city. It's not owned by the city. It's within their incorporated boundaries. This property is actually within the county of Santa Barbara, not an incorporated city, but happens to be owned by the city.
I mean, and I can add to that, because I do know of at least, I think about 4 parcels on the west end that are designated on this map as being owned by the city of Santa Barbara. They actually are owned by the city of Santa Barbara City Schools, and it's a historical in that way back when all of this was started. Every jurisdiction in the United States, a parcel was large pieces of property were given to the school district, and the school district literally still holds ownership over those properties. I mean, I happen to know that because they're directly above my property. And then some of these other properties here that are listed to the city of Santa Barbara are actually these long skinny ones that are over there at that end. Those are actually where the Edison power poles are. Now, it's owned by the city of Santa Barbara, and Edison has easements to have their transmission poles, but on an ownership map, it's going to show up as the city of Santa Barbara. So that's what I know about the west end of the community.
That's interesting. Thank you.
In addition to the Montecito Community Plan and the MA Mountainous Area Designation and the basic development standards and policies of that Montecito Community Plan as they relate to the mountainous area of Montecito, there are two additional sets of regulations that are used in determining whether or not development in that area should be approved or not. And they are, of course, the Montecito Land Use and Development Code and the Montecito Architectural Guidelines. The first of these, the Montecito Land Use and Development Code, which you know we recently adopted in October 17th of last year, which is a new compilation of all the different zoning regulations pertaining to Montecito, except for the coastal zone, and we're now in the process of folding those in as well. The Land Use and Development Code, basically within 3 sections of that code, provide regulations that address development in the Montecito mountainous area. The first being the resource management zone itself. The second are ridgeline and hillside development standards that apply to certain development within that area. And lastly, the Montecito Hillside Overlay District, or HMON as it's abbreviated. The first of these, the resource management zone, the purpose of that zone district, as stated in the development code, is to protect lands that are unsuited for intensive development. And June earlier mentioned that within the MA designation, it talks about how that low-density residential development is allowed. By density, what we mean is the number of residential units per acre in that case. And so for the mountainous area land use designation, when it talks about 40 acres or 100 acres or 320 acres minimum parcel size, that translates into the resource management zone of a similar numerical description after the zone district on the zoning map, and basically allows either one dwelling per 40 acres, one dwelling per 100 acres, or one dwelling per 320 acres, with the caveat that existing legal lots, even if they're smaller than that zoning designation would normally provide for, may still be allowed to have one single-family dwelling on them. The criteria for determining if something goes into the RMZ zone is similar again to what was shown for the mountainous area land use designation. That is slopes that in excess of 40%, valleys surrounded by slopes of 40%, isolated tablelands, and areas with outstanding resource values such as ESH areas and watershed protection. And feel free to stop me anytime if you have questions. This gets a little complicated because the overlapping and sort of interweaving nature of some of these regulations. There's the RMZ zone, as originally stated, is not suited for intensive development, and that's reflected in the list of allowable uses. And in your packet, you should have a table that lists out the RMZ zone and the 1E1 zone district and the comparison of the allowable uses and the permit requirements for those different uses. So you can see as you look down the two, and I'm sorry I didn't make this into a slide for people in the audience, it just would have gotten way too small to read. The number of allowable uses in the RMZ zone is much more restricted than what's allowed in the standard R1E1 zone district. And in many cases, the level of permitting required is more stringent. For example, something that may be a permitted use allowed with a simple land use permit in the R1E1 zone district requires, for example, a conditional use permit in the RMZ zone. And a lot of times things that are allowed by a conditional use permit in the R1E1 zone district are not allowed at all in the RMZ zone as well. So what you'll find again is that one of the basic purposes of this zone district is to protect these mountainous areas, and one of the methods by doing that is to restrict the number of allowable uses that may occur within that area. Recently, your commission considered a case which involved, this is in the last year, last part of 2006, that involved a dwelling within the RMZ zone, and part of that request was to allow a swimming pool and water storage tanks. And staff was recommending denial of that, at least that portion of the project, because those uses were not allowed in that zone. So your commission asked us, and we responded to amend the Montecito Land Use and Development Code to allow a restricted set of accessory uses within the RMZ zone. And we did that and came back with you with an amendment in which the board also adopted that now allows swimming pools and water storage tanks as accessory structures to single-family dwellings in the RMZ area. But those are the only accessory uses allowed. So for example, if you wanted to build an outbuilding such as a detached garage or a large studio of some sort or a hobby room, that would not be allowed to occur in that zone district. Also attached to the table of the comparison of the RMZ and R1E1 zone districts, it lays out the findings, page 3 of that attachment, that are required for approval of development in the RMZ zone. The first section, Section A, findings required for approval of all land use permits, applies to all development. And then under Section B, these are additional findings that are required to approve a swimming pool or water storage tank in the RMZ zone. And again, you look at those findings, and what it addresses is the protection of that existing setting by requiring that there will only be minimal alteration of the topography, that it will not cause erosion downstream, that there will not cause any significant adverse effect on ESH areas or biological resources, and lastly, that the project will be screened from public view. So bearing in mind that, again, this area is very sensitive, not only for resource purposes, but also because, as June mentioned, it does provide a backdrop for the Montecito community.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Langle, the special care home with 14 clients, how big can that be? Is there a special size issue there?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Phillips, that's a question that the Board of Supervisors is currently wrestling with, having just gone through that situation in a community in Santa Ynez, or I'm sorry, Santa Maria. There is no upper threshold or set size as far as a special care home for 14 or fewer clients. At this point, it is a ministerial permit. Typically, people who operate special care homes are not seeking to, make large mansions to house these type of facilities, but it could be fairly large to have a dwelling that has 14 separate bedrooms in it. Mm-hmm. Now, there are findings that are required to be made along with that type of a permit, even though it's ministerial, and that's basically that it's compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. And that was the issue that the Board of Supervisors found, that the proposal for the Santa Maria area was not consistent with, and actually denied a special care home for 14 people on that basis because they felt it was too big when compared to the surrounding residential area.
Thank you.
Commissioner Burrows.
What is the working definition of a special care home in this context?
Basically, a special care home is one that provides continuing care at various levels for certain classes of people that have a license from the State Department of Social Services for that type of care. So it could be indigent care at a very benign level of just providing a residential place for them to reside with like meal preparation service, something like that. It could be, for example, a small Alzheimer's facility where it's 24-hour full-time care for that person because they cannot care for themselves at all.
So it is not a home for people that are on probation, that kind of thing, from the juvenile justice or other justice system?
There are some types of community care licensing provisions for group homes for juveniles, but it's typically one where they, again, are being cared for some reason other than the fact that they are just, transitioning, let's say, from a controlled facility back into the real world. But, they do allow for homes for children where their parents are unable to care for them and things like that. Again, this is all licensed through the State Department of Social Services, and there are certain minimum requirements that must be met in order to obtain that licensing.
Thank you.
Within the RMZ zone, design review is required for all structures. Therefore, the Montecito BAR will get involved if anything is proposed for development in that zone district. The second set of regulations that apply to this area would be the Ridgeline Hillside Development Standards. These kick in whenever there's a 16-foot drop in elevation within 100 feet of the footprint of the proposed development. So, you could have, even on these areas where there is, fairly extensive topography, fairly steeply sloped topography, you could have flatter areas where actually this standard would not apply due to the existing slope, or based on a careful location of that structure. And we have seen that in certain instances where, because the drop in elevation was only, let's say, 15 feet, it did not have to comply with this section of the ordinance. But what this section of the ordinance does do is, when that trigger is found, is it sets up more restrictive height limits for any structures within that area. 25 feet in the urban area and 16 feet in the rural area. Within the RMZ zone, which is confined to the rural area, we're then talking about a 16-foot normal height limit for all structures. Now, there are exemptions that are allowable within that set of development regulations to that height limit, and these exemptions may either be allowed by the Montecito BAR based on situations of that it constitutes better design to allow an increase in the building height, or that the existing, or that the proposed structure at the height that is proposed for is consistent with the existing development in that area. So, for example, if you've got a lot or a parcel that's currently vacant that's surrounded by structures that are 25, 30 feet tall because they were built some time ago, the applicant is typically going to ask for relief from that 16-foot height limit, because to do so would put them at somewhat of a disadvantage when compared to their neighbors. There's also a whole set of development standards that are come into play when the Ridgeline Hillside Development Standard threshold is triggered, and those have to do with location, where the location of a structure on the ridgeline is discouraged, dealing with design to make sure that it conforms to the surrounding terrain, to minimize grading, to make sure that the materials and color are compatible with the natural surroundings of the area, and lastly, that landscaping is used to integrate the building into its setting. The third set within the development code that applies within this area is the Montecito Hillside Overlay Zone. And the purpose of this overlay is, again, to preserve, enhance, protect the visually prominent areas, protect them from erosion, scarring, flood, and fire hazards, and to promote safety.
Commissioner Phillips. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Langle, the preserve, comma, enhance, comma, et cetera, under purpose and intent,
Yes.
can that sentence be read so that any phrase separated by commas could stand independently? Could it be read to read preserve and enhance and protect visually prominent areas? Or does it require the other phrases to be present? For instance, biologically significant or important.
I think the idea here is that the whole area is visually prominent, biologically important, and it consists of naturally mountainous areas.
So all those ingredients would be necessary.
All those, well, I think all those apply, no matter what the specifics of the situation is. So that if you're in an area that has the HMON overlay applied to it, again, this is.
Oh, it's overlaid because of that.
Because of these situations, right. So that it, again, applies, as June showed you on the map, to a wide swath of property. And you may have lots within that area that don't have, let's say, any biologically important areas. But the overlay zone, in and of itself, as it's applied to property, this is the purpose of applying that zone. So when these things are present, it kicks in these protective standards.
If I understood your question, though, you were questioning whether all three had to be present at the same time, and I doubt if that was the intent of the regulation. I'm sure it's any one of the three would place it into that. Am I correct, Mr. Lango?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you are correct. Again, this is the purpose of when to apply this particular overlay. And again, it's a pretty wide swath of property, and these are some of the main features that were determined to be important as to why this overlay would be applied to this area.
Right. But the overlay already exists,
That's
regardless
correct.
of which of those. Thank
That's
you.
correct, yes. Under applicability, this overlay zone applies to the mountainous areas and the adjacent areas, as shown on the Montecito zoning map, and June previously described to you where those are. Again, as she mentioned, this overlay does sort of creep down below the urban-rural boundary into a small area that is actually within the urban area and does not and is not zoned RMZ either. So it's the application of this overlay zone is a bit broader than just areas north of the urban-rural boundary. Again, there are certain exceptions that may be applied by the decision makers in applying this overlay zone and the standards to development proposed. And they deal with if you are reconstructing an existing lawful structure to the same or lesser size, height, and location, then the new overlay zone standards would not apply to that reconstruction. And the second exemption, which is an important one, is that certain subdivisions that are approved that have specific conditions that mitigate the size, the visibility, the materials and colors, erosion, flooding. In other words, those things that the standards of the Montecito Hillside Overlay is addressing. If you have subdivisions that already do that, then structures that are constructed within those subdivisions are also not subject to the requirements of this overlay. And so, for example, the one example I can think of is at the Oak Creek Canyon subdivision that was approved several years ago, has been determined to have these conditions that supplement or take the place of the requirements of the overlay zone. And so as development occurs within this subdivision, it is not subject to the overlay zone.
There actually is another one, which is Coyote Springs.
Okay.
It is in there, and we have our own mitigation measures that were put in place when that subdivision was done.
And also, this can be applied to new subdivisions as well. So if, for example, your commission approves the Berrig Estates subdivision at some upcoming hearing and provides a sufficient set of conditions that address these topic areas, then the development within those subdivisions would also not be subject to the Montecito Hillside Overlay. The overlay zone does contain a set of development standards that must be adhered to. Most specifically is that any development shall comply with the Montecito Architectural Guidelines, Section 4, subparagraph C, the Hillside Development Standards. And so this provides a link then between the Land Use and Development Code by virtue of this overlay to the Montecito Architectural Guidelines, specifically this section dealing with Hillside Development Standards. So we'll now move into the guidelines, unless there are any questions at this point.
No, please proceed.
Overall, referring to the guidelines as a whole, the purpose of those guidelines is to assist property owners, architects in designing projects that will be harmonious with the Montecito's existing character. They're supposed to serve as a guide for the MBAR and planning and development staff and the review authorities such as yourself in the design review process. Important to remember is that the Montecito BAR is the body that's designated as being responsible for administering the architectural guidelines. And they do this through their design review process as development is proposed, and they review those applications. Really, even when you look at the guidelines and the weight that's given to certain of the standards, they can have more of an effect on regulating development than the actual development code itself, because of the extensive nature of those development standards and the latitude, I guess you would say, that it gives the Montecito BAR in determining what is consistent with those development standards. The development code contains triggers that make the architectural guidelines applicable, and then you get into the guidelines themselves, and you have to then look at the comprehensive set of development standards that they contain. As far as applicability goes of that one section, the hillside guidelines, it applies to three basic areas: the Montecito hillside overlay, where the Montecito hillside overlay has been designated, wherever there is the ridgeline hillside development standard, such that there's a 16-foot drop within 100 feet of the proposed structure. And just in case we've missed anything between those two, it's whenever the average slope of the developed area is 20% or greater. So if any of those three criteria are met, you're then subject to this one section, the hillside guidelines and development standards of the overall Montecito architectural guidelines. This section provides specific development standards for development in the hillside area, and they relate to minimizing the visual bulk, certain height restrictions, restrictions on grading and retaining wall exposure, again, controlling the materials and colors, protecting special features of the site, be they topographical or resource, and lastly, again, the use of extensive use of landscaping to minimize the visual impact of these structures in this area.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Langle, could you discuss scenic view corridors for a second? Is this a totality of a look at a hillside, or is it more specific?
I think I can answer that question maybe. In the architectural guidelines, the number 1 site development standard says the visual bulk of residential structures shall be minimized as viewed from scenic view corridors as shown on Figure 37, the visual resource map, which is included in the Montecito Community Plan EIR. So what was done at that time, Commissioner Phillips, is a number of people sort of took a look and said, whoa, well, you can see like this, and you can see like this from roads that were considered to be scenic corridors. So it wouldn't necessarily mean everything from every road. It would be from what has been designated as a scenic view corridor. And there are actually action items in the community plan that say something like when funds become available, the community might want to look at designating future scenic view corridors that are not now designated as that. Now we've never done that. We've never, gone ahead with that action item, but it is in the community plan that it could happen. We've got some, we could make more if we wanted to. I think that's accurate, right?
One point of clarification, I don't believe the plan itself or these guidelines actually created an official designation or a mapping for those corridors. It gives a reference back to the study that was done.
Yeah, it's
in
in
the
the EI. You
environmental
have to go
document.
back, in order to find that
Right, so it's
study,
an
you have to go back
evaluative
to the
process.
EIR.
It's not like a mapped overlay.
Yeah.
But is it it's a condition precedent to enforce minimalization of visual bulk? Is that true?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Phillips, that's correct. If this structure is visible from one of these scenic view corridors as shown within the EIR for the Montecito Community Plan, then the Montecito's BAR's role is to ensure that the visual bulk as viewed from that corridor is minimized.
Okay, thank you.
Please proceed.
I guess I would have one more question.
Commissioner Overall.
Has any recent, last 5 years, any update of that, the validity of those scenic corridors been done?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner, overall, no, there's been no recent review of those corridors. Thank you. Moving on, with every good set of guidelines and development standards, you have adjustments when necessary. Provide case-by-case exemptions. It does allow adjustments to the development standards under certain situations, and again, if it would result in better design without negatively impacting the neighborhood compatibility or the view shed, if it's not located within 100 feet of an environmentally sensitive habitat area, if the impacts from erosion, potential erosion from that project are minimized, and if the project includes fire retardant landscaping. Again, since it's the Montecito BAR's duty and responsibility to implement these development standards, it's their jurisdiction to grant these exceptions, subject, of course, to appeal to your commission. In the last part of this section on the hillside standards, there's a sort of graphical depictions of do this, not this type of thing. What is good design? What is bad design? And so it talks about, and within that last section, size, bulk, and scale guidelines. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. No, this is again the first part of that set of development standards has size, bulk, and scale guidelines that the floor area of a house has to comply with, unless again the BAR grants an allowance or an increase to those floor area guidelines, and states that the floor area of the house should be in scale with the existing development in the immediate area, and talks about these floor area limitations that are based on the lot size that is proposed for.
Commissioner Burrows.
What do we mean by in the immediate area? How is that defined?
That's always a good question.
I know. Do you have any clarity on that?
Well, I mean, you could be so strict as to say the immediate area is those lots that are immediately adjacent to the proposed, where the development is proposed for. Typically, we're not that restrictive, and we include those residences that surround the proposed site of development, and maybe some lots further out. But again, it's really a subjective decision that has to be made on a case-by-case basis, and I can't give you a good, solid answer as to what immediate means. It's not defined.
Mr. Chair?
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you. I'm concerned that when a body like this commission is interpreting an intent, an ordinance, an intent that that there's a suggestion that prior perhaps inappropriately built projects, homes, would control our decision as to approving one before us. It seems bad law, bad result, bad commission behavior to do that. On the other hand, it seems to be built in here, and I'm wondering how we balance that with a developer owner's reliance on this type of verbiage that suggests, well, that looks pretty big, and I'd like one like that, even though, again, it may be collectively our view that those homes weren't minimized visually. There could have been more minimalization or reduction of visual impact. How do you comment on that?
Well, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Phillips, that's always going to be an inherent tension when you're adopting a new set of regulations that applies to an area that's partially developed. How do you account for the pre-existing development, which may not be consistent with that which you're trying to control, and in many cases is the reason you're adopting these new set of development standards, is to not allow that to happen in the future. I think, to answer your question, though, it doesn't, to my mind, it doesn't control.
Mm-hmm.
It allows for the Montecito BAR to grant an adjustment.
Or not.
Or not. But the language is permissive. It says they may grant an adjustment
Mm-hmm.
based on this criteria. It does not say thou shalt grant an adjustment if the situation is present.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Moving on again with the hillside guidelines, they talk about site design and grading, architecture, hillside landscaping, fire hazard reduction. This is beginning to sound probably a little repetitive because, again, it does sort of repeat that's what's found in the other sets of regulations as well. And this section provides, and that's what I had skipped ahead to earlier, a set of pictures or diagrams, if you will, as to how a structure should be placed on the site. So not perched right on the edge of a ridge, but set back away from it. How landscaping walls should be designed, retaining walls should be designed so they're not visually obtrusive. It provides certain pictorial guides to architects and landowners as to how a certain dwelling should be designed so it's consistent with these guidelines, and also provides the Montecito BAR some sort of guidance as well. So that concludes my portion of this briefing.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, a suggestion, since the BAR did ask Marcia Ziles and Tony Spann to come and participate in this, and because since Marcia has a PowerPoint, maybe you want to go there next.
I was going to ask you how you
review
would
those.
suggest we proceed. And is it appropriate in a briefing like this that we accept testimony from members of the public
Yes.
as well?
Yes.
Okay, because I was hoping we could, because we have quite a few people that I think are
Yes.
interested in this subject.
Mr. Chair, how long does is it expected that the MBAR briefing part of this will take?
Well, I'm not sure, but I guess.
Well, maybe they could answer that
I'm
question.
sure they can let us know. And by the way, we also have a rather extensive set of materials that were submitted by the Montecito Association, authored by Victoria Green, that I guess we should accept into the record.
Mr. Chair, that's a good thing to note. I don't think you need to
Because it's not a
make a
hearing.
motion, because this isn't a hearing, and it's really a cover memo within existing documents that the commission is.
Yes, it is. In fact,
familiar
it's it tracks along the same as your staff report with some specifics pulled out of the codes. Thank you.
Great.
So how long do you expect
I'm
to
not
take?
sure how the MBAR wishes to.
What does that look like, Marcia, like time? Oh, okay, I mean, it just, the size of the amount of, looked like more to me than that.
Yeah,
so-
why don't we take a 10-minute break at this point then? And then we
Thank
can
you,
probably
that's
come
what I
back
was
and-
headed towards.
I had that feeling. Okay, so we'll come back at a quarter till. I'm going to call us back into order, and I believe, Marcia, were you going to make our, oh, excuse me, Noel Langle. Whoever wants to proceed next, I'm sorry. I'm looking for whose light is on. I
Mr.
see.
Chair, I just wanted to make one comment
Director
before
Black.
Ms. Giles gives the presentation for the BAR, and that is, if you look at your material, you'll notice I took it. I took her PowerPoint presentation, so you're getting a new copy. It's being run right now because we had to make a few minor changes.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Marcia Zillis, and I'm on the board of the Montecito Architectural Review. And sitting to my right is Tony Span, Chair of the Montecito Board of Architectural Review.
Thank you both for
Can you
for
hear me?
taking the time to join us here today.
Okay. Is that better? Okay. We're starting out, the first slide just says that this is a discussion on the Resource Management Zone District, and our presentation on behalf of the Montecito Board of Architectural Review is bringing up issues that we find are puzzling, or we need resolution from the board as to what direction you're actually asking us to go in. We get our findings from the zoning ordinance, the Montecito zoning ordinance. I did last night get online and see the Montecito land use, that it was 350 pages, so I skipped that. I stuck with what I knew. Unfortunately, it's a description of resource management, and this PowerPoint isn't coming out. It's essentially, I'm validating that it says limited development, protection of our environmental resources, and it describes the slopes, same as has already been done. Next slide.
Is it possible to increase the size of the highlighted areas? It's difficult
Yeah,
from
I
here.
highlighted it, and it doesn't, I shouldn't have done that. I should have.
Mr. Chair, I think that much of at least the last two slides, the one before and again this one, you actually can find copies of that information in the packet that was provided by Victoria Green at the Montecito Association. So, I mean, like the one right before is in there, and this is also in that packet. I mean, I can't, because the pages aren't numbered consecutively, I can't, but at least the Montecito Ridgeline Hillside Development Standards are right before the architectural guidelines, and development standards for the RMZ zone is in that same section. So that's, I mean, if you flip through, you can see
Mr. Chair?
some of this information.
They are
Mr.
going to bring this
Right.
back to us
And
as
Mr.
well.
Chair, if you, the page number is 116 in the excerpt from
Right.
Victoria Green's.
I do see that.
packet.
Thank you.
I'm not covering everything. I think that you have, essentially, planning staff has covered pretty much all of this. I'm just verifying again. This is our understanding, of it.
You might want to verbally highlight the issues that you see that are I know you have physically there, but you might want to mention the ones that, as we go through, that you feel are most important for us to be thinking of.
Okay. Yeah.
I could read it. It says, the goal, GOM1 says, protect the public health, safety, welfare by preserving the hillsides in the most natural state feasible. And action GOM1111 says, development standards shall be developed as part of the Montecito architectural guidelines and development standards for the mountainous areas and other areas of steep slopes in order to protect these and adjacent areas from erosion, scarring, flood, fire hazard, and to promote safety.
Thank you. Thank you. Next. Mr. Chairman. Okay, and then here are
Yes.
architectural guidelines and
Yes.
development standards.
If you could hold on for a second. Commissioner
I'm wondering
Burrows.
how long the copying will take. I think this would be much more helpful if we had this copy before us. Okay. I mean, if it's only a minute or two, is it in process? That would be really helpful.
There we go.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Marcia.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Phillips?
Ms. Black, the image the public is seeing is not, it's delayed, I guess. Is that what's going on?
Mr. Chair, it does look as though it's
Watch, I'm
delayed
moving,
by
but
a-
it's not going on here.
They have a 15-minute
there you go.
delay,
Which
just
is
so
a good
that
No, it's
they
about a
can-
15-second delay, and it's so we can
For all
cut
the
you
stupid
out.
questions that we asked.
They're editing those out as we
But
go.
the
For some
public-
reason,
the
there's a-
public
just a
will hear
slight
all
delay.
this at
Yes.
some point?
Yes. And, Mr. Chair, just to remind the commission, what you see on the screen is not always necessarily what is being shown on TV.
I understand.
So I think
But thank you
GATV
for
does a
reminding
good
me.
job of tracking and putting the overheads on and things like that.
No
Okay,
checking your
so
hair.
Basically, Tony said he didn't want to read all this, so if you have it, do you have it in your packet?
We do. So you can proceed as per your plans.
We're just saying essentially the same thing. It's nice, what has been said by planning staff already, and our guidelines comply with that. Next is a map of the Montecito, and I think we've already seen one of these. June put one of these up, overlay. And then this is a planned community within the HMON overlay district that is zoned RMZ and is not subject to our scrutiny in regards to complying with size, bulk, and mass because they predate the community plan pre-1992 and have their own CC&Rs regarding development. And we put that in because we often get development in this area being in an RMZ zone compared to why aren't other projects being allowed in other RMZ zones, similar to the development here. Next.
Commissioner Overall.
I just want to ask you a question. I am clear on this, am I not? Well, this is not subject to your discretion as to the size, bulk, and scale. The other features, the scarring and all those things that might take place in a development, although the development envelopes have been prescribed for you, that's still part of your purview, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Next. I wanted to just veer off right now, just for a humorous little sidebar. And if we think that development can't happen, my question is, how did the Painted Cave get started? And if you see here, there's the community right up there. Next slide. There it is, hanging off the side of the cliff. And next slide. Bobby and Floppy Hyde's houseboat. There was no building in the mountain zone, so Bobby Hyde got a bulldozer and made a pond lake, and built a houseboat on it. And here's a picture of the houseboat on the pond, thus became the Painted Cave community. So it's just a reminder to all of us that we need to be careful about things. Next. And some problems we had with the hillside guidelines in relationship to an RMZ project. Our hillside guidelines are good and thoughtful, but some issues left us puzzled. Hopefully this discussion will clarify these issues and bring up some new issues for consideration. Next. RMZ districts should have limited development. Our guideline addresses FAR values relating to amount of acreage the parcel is rather than the amount of actual buildable area. Areas not exceeding 20% slope. We would like to see the issue addressed so that large buildings are built on small, this issue addressed so that large buildings are not built on small lots, and the guidelines are saying that they must remain invisible and blend in. The language is there. It's impossible to do it based on the FAR. At least we are having a hard time with it. Maybe you can tell us the reasoning.
Could you restate that again for us? The issue, frame the
You
issue.
could have a 20-acre parcel. I can't see that slide. Is that oftentimes these parcels, there's 20 acres. Can I borrow your glasses? I can't. And I think on this one it says, those are sunglasses. I think it's I can't read the slide there. Something. But in excess of 7,000 square foot house can go in on a 10-acre parcel. But out of that 10 acres, you may only have a half acre that's actually buildable. The rest is all sloping. So kind of, how do we balance this out with, on hillsides? That's our question.
I understand.
Next. Oh.
Would you like us to maybe make a list of, maybe we'll have a list of these, because I don't think it's the time. We're not actually going to answer these questions. What we're going to do is this is an opportunity for discussion, not for really deliberation and decision-making. So I would suggest to my fellow commissioners that we just make notes of the ones that we think are important, and if need be, follow up later with some sort of more definitive analysis and comments.
Next.
Please proceed. I'm sorry
Thank
to
you.
slow you down there.
Okay. Size, bulk, and scale guidelines for properties in scale with the development on similar sized parcels in the immediate area. Table 2 shall serve as a reference for this purpose. A project with a floor area size substantially in excess of the floor area of the immediately surrounding properties will have the burden of demonstrating that the project cannot be viewed by surrounding property owners due to siting, or that its spatial volume, mass, bulk, and scale, when taken together with its lot size, setbacks, and landscaping, does not make it incompatible with similar surrounding properties. And then the question that we're proposing here is that the hillside guideline tells us that there are houses up there that are not compatible with the 1995 regulations, but that we need to be harmonious with them. That's the way we're kind of reading it. That's the way I think other people are reading it. And in order to set new guidelines for there, how do we go about doing that?
Oh,
Next.
thank you. This is the issue that Commissioner Phillips just addressed, and I believe staff's answer on this one was it's permissive and not required to be compatible with existing, if I understood your statement there correctly.
Well, is there a way to make
In other words, if I understood staff's answer is you're not required to make it compatible with existing or pre-existing uses if they don't meet the guidelines.
Mr. Chair, I think I would state that a little differently.
I'm sure it can be better than what I
Rather
just
than to
bungled
say
through.
it's not compatible, I think you can find something compatible and still require that it be much smaller, lower profile, different building materials perhaps, but still find it compatible. What I think Mr. Langle was explaining to the commission before is that you don't have to build upon, I'm trying to select my words carefully, the existing setting that existed prior to regulations that are intended to address some issues that arose from the existing development,
So
if that
there-
makes sense. So I don't think you'd say, well, that the BAR isn't bound to make compatibility findings, but they don't have to give new development the same square footage, height, et cetera, that these guidelines were intended to address
So
as existing development.
If I might restate that, and let me try this a different way. An applicant that says, I should be able to build what my next door neighbor built, that doesn't carry water, does it?
Okay.
If it does not meet the guidelines, that argument is interesting but not decisive.
Okay.
Mr.
All right.
Chair,
Commissioner
Yes.
Phillips.
have you just stated a new definition of compatibility, neighborhood compatibility? Or is it the same one that we would use in other designations?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Phillips, I don't think I stated a new definition of compatibility. I'm just trying to explain that the BAR and your commission don't need to look at what exists in a neighborhood and say, well, we have to give every subsequent property owner that. Because it would completely circumvent the changes that were made in conjunction with the Montecito Community Plan and the subsequent design guidelines. So I don't think I've changed the definition. I just think I made some clarification of how you look at existing development in the context.
I agree with you. I can't imagine how that would be effective and valid. However, we see many homes that are pre-existing the community plan, and we look for compatibility. We look at them in determining compatibility in other zoning designations. And I'm just wondering if there is a difference here that I'm missing.
Commissioner Overall? Oh, excuse me. Commissioner Gottstanger.
Well, it seems to me that it's that my opinion that when you're looking at a neighborhood, and specifically inside the RMZ building zone, which is the area that we're dealing with today, when you look at compatibility, you, as a discretionary board like ours, this one, or a review board like MBAR, you have to be looking at all the guidelines, all the standards that are presently in the document, starting from the overlaying comprehensive plan down to the Montecito community plan, and then make a decision based on all of those documents as to whether a building is compatible with the environment in which it sits. Not compatible with one building here, one building here, one building here, but compatible with the entire environment. That was the intention when this was all written. You know, that's why it goes on, why that section of the architectural guidelines is almost as long as the section that deals with flatlands and neighborhood compatibility. You know, and I know that that was the intention of writing that, was like, how do we give decision makers and the public and homeowners a package to determine whether a building is compatible with the existing neighborhood. Not building to building, but the existing environment.
Mr. Chair?
So it's incumbent upon the decision makers to be looking at these documents and deciding what parts, or, you know, all of it applies. All of it applies,
Ms.
not
Pacheco.
just the numbers.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I'd like to follow on something that Commissioner Gottstanker was saying. That was a very good overview, and just give you a couple of examples, perhaps, of where that would fit in. We have the architectural guidelines, which has many features to it, one of which is a floor area table, one of which is a term on looking at compatibility with the surroundings, all I'd like to mention as a side note that are meant to give further protections to view sheds and the mountain drop back, not lesser protection. That being said, there's a whole page on grading standards. There's a whole page on architectural standards and different ways that a project should tuck in and fit in to a site. There's a whole page on landscaping and the types of landscaping that is most appropriate for these high scenic areas. And all of that has to be taken together in that decision. There's, in addition to the guidelines, Montecito policies and other comprehensive plan policies like our hillside watershed and visual resources policies of the land use element, one of which is very important in this area. There's a visual resource policy for the rural areas of the county, and as we saw earlier, these RMZ zones are in that rural designated area. And in that policy, which has to be read in concert with all of this, that policy states that the test of compatibility for a rural area parcel is not so much the house next door, but how it fits in with the natural terrain. And some ways that we've done that before is looked at whether it's more visible or less visible than other houses. We've looked at the elevation level at which the property is sited to see how that compares with surrounding elevation views and that sort of thing. So you do have to take all of this together when you make a decision.
So a different standard for compatibility.
In the land use element of the comprehensive plan, the visual resources policy for rural areas is worded differently than the visual resources policy for urban areas.
Next.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, on this, the hillside diagram of proper placement of house on site. We see the house being placed further back into the hillside versus sitting right on the edge. But the setbacks are 16 feet from the edge of the ridge. And one of my questions is, should we look at, there are different options here. Alternatives to this diagram could show a house sunken down into the hillside with earth naturally bermed along the ridge line instead of a cutoff and expecting trees to kind of hide the edge of the hillside. But a bigger question comes up: what good is any diagram or guideline of 16-foot setback from edge of ridge if infinity pools are allowed at the ridge line?
Well, there's nothing in the ordinance that literally says that infinity pools are allowed on the edge of on the toe of the slope. It doesn't, we don't automatically grant that an infinity pool is allowed to be pushed all the way to the front of the slope. That's a site, in my way of thinking, that's a site design, and that comes within the purview of the MBAR to decide whether an infinity pool at the edge, at the toe of the slope is an appropriate site design. I don't think we can, I don't think in this discussion here, that every situation could necessarily be addressed in the ordinance or additions to the RMZ zone district or whatever that will address every instances that's going to come up as far as site design is concerned. That's why we have a planning commission and why we have an MBAR. If it doesn't work inside all the other guidelines, then an infinity pool, you can't have one. You just can't have
So
one.
you're saying you can have pools up there, but we could rule someone requesting an infinity pool that it's not appropriate site.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
There's nowhere says that you just get one just because you've got a site up there.
You can rule that the pool's not appropriate, forget the infinity pool.
But you allow it, though. It's allowed now.
It can be
It's
allowed.
allowed as one of the possible things that could happen on a site.
Okay.
One possible thing that could happen. It's not given that every site should have an infinity pool. You know, I mean, my neighbor has an infinity pool. You can't see it from anywhere, and it's in the RMZ 40 district. So there's no issue with that particular infinity pool.
Thank you.
Commissioner Overall?
In this same paragraph, I would point out, at least my interpretation would be that 16 feet is not an absolute. Maybe it requires 160 feet in order to be consistent with the objectives of what you're trying to do. These are guidelines, I guess, back to that.
Thank you, Commissioner Overall. Next slide. This is a sort of an off the side, but an issue that's been one of mine for a long time, and that is that Montecito faces due south. Factoring for magnetic south puts our little South Coast area at the little jog in the map as facing due south. That means that our mountains and hillsides could be threatened by glaring photovoltaic arrays and/or solar water heating array to heat the spas, tubs, hot tubs, and pools. And if I'm reading it correct, hot tubs and pools and spas newly constructed will require solar arrays, according to, if you go to the next slide. Oh, not that. Which says, I think it's item number 4. Tony, I'm having a hard time reading this.
On the fall forces, all solar panels shall be approved by the BAR.
Okay, and so basically, it's just the findings that it says it can be approved by the BAR, but there's a new solar law out, and if you go to the next slide, it's Solar Energy Law S1 that was introduced by Governor Schwarzenegger and was enacted to put 1 million solar roofs within the next 10 years on houses in California. And there is, for new construction, it may be mandatory, not optional. So we need a little more clarification to us about what this law means in terms of our hillsides and. Okay, next.
Well, I mean, to me, it's the same issue. It's a site design issue. Yes, we may have to deal with a mandatory law that puts up the solar panels for both electricity and for water. It's incumbent upon the property owner to determine where to put those inside of review of a site plan where it doesn't, there's somewhere in the guidelines it talks about reflective material. It doesn't say that that the law, and I haven't seen the actual wording of the law, but the law doesn't say that if you put one up, it has to be where everybody sees it. That's once again a site design issue. And if it's placed in an inappropriate place, it's in an inappropriate place. Find a different place.
Commissioner Gottstanker, in order for a solar panel to be effective, it needs to be facing south.
I understand, and there are places in the hillside, and I offer my particular subdivision. Everybody in my subdivision, all of us are in the RMZ 40. All of us operate on photovoltaic panels. All of us have hot water heating, and I dare you to find them from looking up.
So you're saying we can deny on visual?
Yeah, or request that they they find another location that's not visually intrusive.
Not only can you should.
Yeah, you should.
I thought maybe we were in conflict with that law, so we were just requesting
I
clarification.
don't know why. I don't see
Maybe
why.
from,
maybe the rest of the commission does.
Diane Black or some more.
I'll get to you.
In this slide right here, I just show you an example of a solar energy proficient facade. And this is photovoltaics as an architectural element. It generates electricity and thermal energy for heating the building. Next.
If you'd hold on for a second, Commissioner Burrows, you have a question?
Thank you, I do. Back to the solar energy law, it says there is one exception to this. What is that?
All resource management zone districts, RMZ, are in the H1 hillside overlay area. There is one exception to this rule, which would be, I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote that, but I know I meant something.
Just to chime in, I think the concern is that we're being told by several applicants that the solar panels are being mandatory and then therefore exempt from BAR review.
Yeah.
That's really the question.
Yeah, that's the question.
So, Mr. Chair, just to clarify, the previous, if you can go back, one more. The reference to swimming pools and spas here is out of Article 4. And one of the things that we did with the Montecito Land Use and Development Code, and I think we pointed this out to the commission when we brought that forward for adoption, is we updated it to be consistent with current state law requirements. And Ms. Ellis is correct that the current state law exempts solar panels that are located on roofs from local land use regulatory authority. So she's correct.
She is correct.
This isn't correct, but she's correct in her concern.
So what you're saying is
if the
solar
solar panels are located on roofs, they are exempt
from
both
review.
BAR review and land use review.
And when was that state law passed? Was that in 2005?
Mr. Chair, that was either late 2005 or early 2006 that went into effect.
So that's a priority that the state of California has
Okay.
mandated.
I'm curious as to, in the particular zone district that we're dealing with where visibility is an issue, you can't you could not disallow a house because of the solar panels, but you could modify its location based on visual issues, can you not?
Yes, you could.
Yes.
Okay.
So you could look at roof pitch, you could look at all sorts of
And say,
things that could affect the.
Given the reflectivity of this particular roof, we don't feel it's appropriate in this zone unless it's back further from the toe of the slope or
Right.
whatever. So that would be a factor in analyzing within the guidelines, I would assume.
Correct.
But it won't get you there on a retrofit
No.
at all.
No, no.
Mr. Chair, one further point of clarification. This, again, from old Article 4, which has been superseded, in where it talks about the solar heating system shall be required pursuant to Chapter 10 of the county code, that's actually not correct anymore. And so I believe we've taken that out of the new code as well.
The new one. Thank you.
Next. Going into how Westmont, we got Westmont to look at a new redesign after 6 years of fighting the community. And this is their new design of green roofs and an eco-friendly, less warehouse look to the campus, was that we asked for them to give us a solar analysis of the site, of their old site master plan. And next. And we
Mr. Chair.
showed to them,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Ms. Sellis, can you restate whether these are your positions or MBAR's positions? Your comments?
well, I mean, I was instrumental in asking for the solar analysis of the site, because I happen to have somewhat of an expertise in solar energy design.
I'm not concerned about your answer. I just want to know what it is. I mean, is it MBAR's position? Are you speaking for MBAR? Or are
I'll
you
try to,
speaking?
Commissioner Phillips and Chair Berg, I'll try to answer that. Marcia didn't have the opportunity to make this presentation to BAR. So a quorum of the BAR did not see this particular presentation. Many of the concepts that are being brought up here today have been brought up before the BAR in specific projects, and those projects have been approved unanimously by the BAR. There's been no conflict. Been no consideration. So I think that the majority of what Marcia is, I'm comfortable saying the majority of what Marcia is presenting today is probably what the MBAR has. There are certain individuals, and I'd like to bring, after the Marcia's presentation, there are certain individuals of the MBAR that have questions and may not agree entirely with Marcia, and I was going to bring those up as part of this discussion. Hopefully that answers your question.
And, Mr. Chair, just one further comment, and that is that I think most of the comments from this point forward are not particularly specific to the RMZ zone, but more design features that could be incorporated elsewhere in Montecito. For example, Westmont is not in the RMZ zone.
Right.
So just wanted to
Thank you for that.
give a little background.
Basically, we're trying to get an idea from the board as to where you want us to go with these designs. So I'm bringing up a whole set of ideas and principles here that, and trying to get your feedback on it. I mean, do you, as Tony said, do you want us to go forward more with an eco-design and a sustainable design in the RMZ zone? Or do you want us to do something with brown tile roofs and things that match the environment color-wise, but our standard, urban construction just moved up the hillside? That's the issue where we're going with this.
Yeah. For my part, I think what you're going to find, and I think you'll find it from the rest of the commissioners here, is, obviously there's good and valid reasons for some of the eco designs that are out there, but they simply become additional design factors that you should take into account. And I think if you have from my perspective, if a project comes forward which, because of its eco-design, is intrusive visually into the community, then you may have to ask them to locate the structures in a way that would not be necessary with a different kind of design. I mean, that would be how I would state it. So it isn't, hey, I've got my best design based on a abstract white box, and now I want to come in and put reflective surfaces all over it and say you can't stop me because of it doesn't work that way. It has to be taken as a package. Staff, am I stating, would that be a rational way we could ask the MBAR to look at these kind of issues? And my fellow commissioners as well.
Question the staff and council. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's no legal authority for us to require, let's call it, eco-friendly design or something like that. And I think, isn't that correct? And in case of the Westmont issue, they volunteered that change. And should we enforce it, demand it on MBAR level and uphold it here, I think we're inviting a legitimate appeal.
Well, in my opinion, I don't think that we have anything in the form of ordinance language at this point. I mean, we could put it down as something that we could consider for discussion at the latest if we wanted to. And ultimately, that's probably what we're looking at, whether we want to beef up the RMZ ordinance language, the RMZ district ordinance language, if we, at the end of this discussion, see that there's problems. But, it seems to me that we do have, we've got a number of things in the guidelines for the Hillside Overlay District that allow the MBAR some flexibility with this. I mean, if you go to site design, projects should be designed to be compatible with the natural features, building locations, and existing open space of the property. Well, if you have an eco-friendly building, a rammed earth building, an adobe-faced building, whatever those particular design elements are of a structure, we can't require at this point that property owners build in those ways. We can encourage that kind of building, and the Hillside Overlay District guidelines allow for that kind of building. It's not like it's not allowed. Absolutely, it would be allowed and be preferable. But right now, we can't enforce that because we don't have anything in the form of an ordinance that says you have to.
Yes.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, since I think the question was also directed maybe to council to some extent, I just wanted to indicate that Commissioner Gotstanker's statement is accurate, is absolutely correct, and I agree with it. And also note, I think that it's interesting in that the term eco-friendly has been used, and Commissioner Bierig, I think, had in mind as a potential eco-friendly building a white slab building made out of very green products with a very reflective solar panel roof, whereas I think where the BAR's subsequent examples are going are more what Commissioner Gottstanker was saying with rammed earth and earth tone and sunk in the ground. And so it really points out what we're saying is you've got the guidelines with a lot of discretion vested in the BAR as to how to implement those consistent with fitting into the landscape as one of those parameters.
Commissioner Burrows.
Going on to the next slide.
Excuse me, just a moment. I believe Commissioner Burrows has a question.
Thank you. My view on this is that the MBAR has a job to do and the Planning Commission has a job to do. Any guidelines or advisories or suggestions that we give to you might be valid as long as as this body sitting with the 5 commissioners that are here. But if you have a change of commissioners, it could become invalid. So I think that we're relying, in my opinion, we're relying on you to interpret these guidelines as you see them. And I appreciate your work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Burrows. Going back to Westmont, you can see here, the summer sun is more like the winter sun, and the winter sun is absolutely no sun on their prior plan. Next. These were taken at two different areas. So we gave Westmont new design guidelines to step down and redesign once we proved to them that they were destroying their environment and taking the light out of their environment. And the design guidelines that we gave them were later codified as Condition 20 of the master plan, and those were buildings shall follow natural contour lines in order to minimize grading and blend in with the existing topography. And that is a guideline that's written into the architectural guidelines. Buildings shall incorporate sustainable and green building designs where feasible. It was the only answer that we could see there to avoid the Costco-esque nightmare of huge buildings. And buildings shall be integrated with existing landscaping, gardens, and historic elements. Actually, we told them to go across an east-west axis, and then buildings shall incorporate roof terracing rather than rooftops where appropriate. That's also in the architectural guidelines. And then, as an extra bonus, we threw in, don't go any further west. That was for the neighborhood. So they were given those design guidelines, and they stepped down for 60 days. Their response it was the prior slide that you saw, which was an eco-friendly design. Next. Okay. The MBAR was asked by members of a recent development team regarding what we felt was an example of good architecture in the RMZ district. This presentation.
Marcia, can you hold up for a second? I
Yeah.
believe Commissioner Overall has a question or comment.
It strikes me that the discussion where we're going would perhaps be more fruitful if, in addition to the work you've done, our commission had a chance to do some work prior to getting into this. This is a pretty far-ranging discussion. I think it's very warranted, but I think it goes quite a long ways beyond the scope of our discussion this morning, the briefing on the RMZ. And I just think it might be more fruitful if we calendared, we did a little bit more background work, so we'd be up to speed on some of the issues that you have and put our thoughts together. I don't know if other commissioners feel the same way, but I'd kind of like to confine this to the one topic that we had.
Well, I bring up the issue of cut and fill and grading when we're dealing with rammed earth and adobe or compressed earth blocks.
From my perspective, Commissioner Overall, I agree, but I wouldn't mind hearing in brief at least which topics that they think they would like to address, because we've got some time today, and I'd like to go through them if we could. It's not to say we're going to make decisions.
May I, Mr. Chair?
Please.
Could you then answer what is the relevance of that last slide on Westmont? That you suggested a more, I'm going to use a terrible term, eco-friendly design, and they agreed. What is the point of that? If they hadn't agreed and appealed that demand, you'd be having a different discussion about that, I suspect. So what is the point? Is it that, are you asking for us to agree that that was the way to go? I happen to think it was, and I think the result was excellent. But is that what you're looking for in that last presentation?
Well, we worked hard to get there's very few examples. We keep getting asked, what do you want in the RMZ zone? And what I would like to see more of is sustainable development. That's because you're there for the resources, the ecological resources, the environmental resources, and building development is just a very minimal part of it. And if I interpret everything correctly. So what I'm showing is, and there are architects that are working very hard at addressing the issues of environment and building, and not in the traditional manner. So I'm bringing up those issues now. And as I said, alternative methods of building, adobe, rammed earth. Well, we have restrictions on cut and fill. We can, it says in spots that we can allow if certain things are we feel as a design, as a review board that it's appropriate to allow that. But we want to know if this would be something that you would allow us to allow more cut and fill on rammed earth, so it looks more earth tones or even earth sheltered. So I was just going to show you some examples of what those things might mean that are built, so that you have a visual idea of what what we're talking about.
Well,
I'm-
if the applicant agrees with that design approach and it's consistent with the environment, of course, I would guess we would agree. But I suspect that it sounds like you're asking for new ordinances or new guidelines, and we can't give you that. Not today. And that's going to take a while, and that takes the whole community to get involved and to determine that that is the type of community that's the type of design the community insists on. But short of that, the approach you took on Westmont successfully is the way that we're going to be proceeding, and that requires the applicant to embrace the eco-friendly issue that you suggested. Short of that, there's a different result.
Mr. Chair, might I suggest that we simply maybe stop interrupting Marcia, let her go through her presentation, and then Commissioner Phillips, you bring up some interesting points, and I think what we'd like to do at the MBR is, we saw this as a discussion. We see this as a way to get the discussion out to the public. This is a public hearing. This is a way, I'll touch on some of this later, but if we were getting designs brought to the MBAR that look like this, we wouldn't be here today.
If I could make a comment, Chairman Span, it's just that, and I think what I'm hearing from Commissioner Phillips is, we're just trying to make sure we understand the question that you're framing for us. You're showing us stuff, and we're not sure what the context of what you're looking for us to respond to, and I think that's what you're hearing. So
Okay.
please do proceed.
Okay, thank you. So this is an attempt to bring up the issues that we've been asked repeatedly. What do you want from us? The project's come back 3 and 4 times. What do you want from us? And we keep pushing it back, pushing it down, getting rid of this, taking that out, and we've been asked directly. So this is my attempt to answer give some more fruitful discussion to designers and architects as to other ways to build. Maybe this town isn't, as eco-savvy as a lot of other towns are, and so I'm just trying to, bring this to issue. Go ahead. Next one. So basically, examples of alternative building materials, construction methods that are more sustainable, rammed earth and adobe, they breathe, and they're much healthier for the environment. I put in here Montecito Community Plan Index of Architectural Guideline Issues, and generally our guidelines provide a very sensitive and thoughtful approach. However, they do not encourage sustainable design, which supports the resources of the environment it is placed in. And next, okay, and then I just show that Santa Barbara has an innovative building review program, similar to the United States Green Building Council LEED residential checklist to encourage, to comply with energy and water, waste treatments, and other sustainable issues. And if you do participate in the innovative building review program, your fees are reduced and your processing is sped up. And then I just show, we don't need to, there's sustainable landscape architecture. Westmont's an example of sustainable landscape architecture. And then there's sustainable architecture, and I can use Westmont again as an example of that. And then next, one example we have here of, this is the natural step, and I'm just going to skip this, but this is the process that UCSB uses in order to analyze how to arrive at a sustainable solution. And it's, suffice it to say, it's at www.naturalstep.org. And I took a full training, 10-week training in that process. So there's a way that you can analyze a site for building. And then this is Adobe. This is Kit Tremaine's house in Montecito. And it's a good example of this. This was the earliest form of building material in Santa Barbara. This Presidio was made from Adobe blocks. Next. And this is rammed earth, and that gives you sort of an idea of the textural way that the rammed earth looks. And it can be sprayed on or it can be poured, thick. And this is a house, I believe, in Tucson. And that pool is heated passively. And then this is just a natural stone from the site. It's it's in Springdale, Utah. It's the Springdale Organic Fruit Company, and it's tucked right into the ridge there. And it's made from the rocks from the site, and it was designed by a sustainable architect named William McDonough. Next. Okay, and this is an example of a green roofs. Westmont College will have green roofs in our hillside guidelines. And it encourages roof terracing, and it also helps with water runoff and other stresses that are put on our systems. And green walls. This is one in front of the Santa Barbara Mission by the seminary, and the other one on the left is a medieval abbey. Adaptive reuse recycle on the left is a Santa Barbara project, the car house that was comprised of 3 wine settling vats, and the one on the right is a 1 million-gallon water tower that may be converted into a residence if the Montecito Water District abandons its use. And so that may be coming before the commission at some point. Next. And so the houseboat is gone, but a partial adobe house was built in its place. Almost everything in this house is recycled or reused. Next. And this is an example of earth shelter, buildings that are built into the ground. This is an EFA radio satellite station designed by Gustav Peichel in Afflens, Austria, as shown in the Green Architecture book by James Wines. Next. This is an aerial view of a proposed house with a moat surrounding it, natural fire protection without the traditional infinity pool, which changes the whole character of the land when introduced. Next. And then pole or point load footings, that reduces the damage to the environment. And Westmont College will be using this in their student housing development amidst significant oak trees. Next. And then this is just a nice example, Charles Johnson's Boulder House. This is in Arizona. He's an architect. Next. How it fits in with the boulders. Next. What the interior is. This house is now on the National Registry. Next. And then this is SITE's work. This is kind of far out work. SITE is actually an acronym for Sculpture in the Environment. And they did a Best Terrarium Showroom. They've done a number of Best Showrooms that are quite unique. And then the one to the right is the Ansel Adams Center in Carmel, California. It won the competition, but it hasn't been built. Next. And this is a Charles Green James House in Monterey, California. And it's just to illustrate next. It illustrates like one of our guidelines, which says break up on the hillsides, break up the component parts to show sensitivity to the natural site. And you can see the footing rising up from the larger rock and getting smaller and smaller. Next. And this is Amelia Ambass's Schlumberger Research Labs in Austin, Texas. Again, just sort of really work. He's one architect that really tries to work with the environment and be sensitive to it, and yet still accomplish buildings and their functions. Next. And that's just sort of a natural, I think that's adobe block that's up on Ortega Ridge. And it's an example of just not being so rectilinear, more wavier and natural. And so this is the end. It says finish on the top there. Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, to follow up, I think you've addressed this. The images that Marcia showed may be to an extreme in that our ordinances currently do not support this kind of architecture. We know that. In fact, there are parts of our ordinances that discourage this type of architecture in terms of grading. I think in the RMZ zone, grading is supposed to be limited to 1,500 cubic yards. The MBAR struggles with this, with the current height definition of the height as well. Current definition of the height it promotes grading, yet other parts of the ordinance and community plan want to limit grading. So we understand that a step needs to be made in order to get where Marcia wants to bring us all. We understand that. We wanted to put it on the table. There are several members of the MBAR and several members of the community that come forward and say, wait a second, time out. Back in '91, there were people such as Commissioner Goxtanker and others in this room that worked hard at the Montecito Architectural Guidelines. They thought about the RMZ zones. That's why there's two tables in terms of FAR. That's why the guidelines are there. There's nothing more we need to do than what we already have that's already exists out there. Why do we have to go this far? What exactly are you after? And if it was okay for Mr. Smith 3 years ago and Mr. Jones 6 years ago, why isn't it okay for me today? And what we're seeing then is we're seeing Spanish homes that are typically designed in the history as white with red tile roofs coming to us as brown-colored buildings. And that's the way they're meeting the RMZ guidelines under the architectural review guidelines today. So our question to you, we understand we can't get there today. Our question to you is to start the discussion, where do we want to go? What's it going to take to get there? And this is really a community discussion. And this is the kind of problems we see on an everyday, every other week basis as projects come to us. And of course, Commissioner Phillips, you hit the nail on the head. When you asked Mr. Langle, you know, when there's a new law that comes into effect, what do you do with the existing buildings? But the question that didn't get answered is, the new law has already been put into effect in '93. The law, and a lot of these homes have been built since then. What about those? Why aren't those now considered the neighborhood? Why aren't those considered compatible? And there are members of the MBAR, certain members of the community that come before us and make those arguments. So that's why we're here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Gotstinger.
Does MBAR at this point have any very specific recommendations that they would like to make to the Planning Commission as to changes that could be made either in the guidelines or in the ordinance, the section of the ordinance that would address some of the concerns? Or are we leaving that up?
Not officially, not at
Okay,
this time.
great. Okay, thanks. I would suggest that might be a place that the MBAR might want to sit down at one of its meetings and have an open public agendized discussion, you know, on possible recommendations that they might want to make to the Planning Commission and to staff to be reviewed, you know, if that's the direction that's felt that we needed to go here.
Commissioner Burrows.
Thank you. I join Commissioner Gotstanger in saying, in my opinion, the best way for your body and for Montecito is to invite Montecito in, have a lot of hearings if they seem to be needed, and find out where Montecito wants to go, because it's not enough that Sue Burrows set the direction or that one of you set the direction. We need to go back the way we were in 1991, 92 with the hearings, obviously not to that degree, but I think that if you had a couple of open forums, invited people in, maybe we're able to address the issues, because many people are uninformed, even though they might have a personal view on how Montecito should look, and see where Montecito wants to go. I think that's a very good idea, and it seems that the public might benefit and be very willing to be involved in these discussions.
Mr. Chair,
Please.
we're talking about a potential ordinance change and guideline change to accomplish the philosophy here?
No, I don't know whether we're contemplating that yet or not.
Well,
You know,
no, but-
I think we're trying to, I think at this point, my understanding is what we, the Planning Commission, are doing is trying to flush out what the issues are in the RMZ zone. Then, once we know what the issues are, then the pathway to resolving those issues would then be decided once we know what the issues are. Today, my understanding, or at least what I was hoping for by requesting the briefing, was to see if we could get the issues out on the table. Like, what's the problem here? You know, and what do we see the problems being in the future? Then what's the method? What's the document that's going to get us going in the direction that we think the community wants us to go? That's where I think we're at today.
It seems to me compelling, Mr. Chair, that to balance the needs of the owner, builder, and the community, the type of architecture Ms. Sellis is identifying might solve a lot of the problems. How do we get there is the step, should we get there? But it's certainly, this zone is unique enough, it seems to me, to justify this type of look, and it's unprecedented in our community to require a type of architecture, although it was done after the earthquake in '28, apparently. So probably legally sustainable, should we go there. But in our experience as a commission, we haven't seen an ordinance change, a guideline change. So I don't know how we would get there, but it seems to me, again, this zone is so unique, and these solutions may well be in everyone's best interest. So I'd argue that we keep going, but
If my fellow commissioners don't mind, I'd like to make a comment, sort of my take on this. I'm not convinced we need a change in our ordinances to get to what you're suggesting. You know, I think that the Board of Architectural Review, I'm not saying I see some hesitation there, Diane, but I think a lot of the things that you're suggesting really consist of interpretation. I'm not saying we don't need community discussion on this, but if we decided as a community that we want to make sure that structures in the resource management zone are really minimized visually to the greatest extent possible, then other than maybe changing the grading ordinance that allow them to be depressed into the ground a little bit more, I'm not sure we have to do more than just say, this is our criteria. The fact that it doesn't comply with the house built last year this is an evolutionary process. We're not being discriminatory. It's just this is now the rules of the road. But I don't see that we can't do that right now. What would we write in the ordinance that would be much different than what we're writing in it, than what it says right now? The community decides what's applicable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sustainable building and an eco-friendly building and all of that can happen. You know, I don't know, at least for myself, I don't know that it's appropriate to dictate a lifestyle
Agreed.
change inside an ordinance.
Well,
that's the problem that I have.
I'm
you know.
making a
I
big-
mean, I live in a neighborhood that in fact, it's kind of interesting that I lived on that houseboat. You know, I lived in Kit Tremaine's house. I mean, there are several buildings that have been used here. I live in a whole neighborhood that's committed to sustainable building, that's committed to protecting its resources. You know, I mean, I own a part of a 98 piece of property that was given over in a 80 acres of that was put in a conservancy by the owners of the property to preserve our watershed, all with it. These are lifestyle issues, you know, and I don't feel that it's appropriate inside of land use ordinances to dictate lifestyle. I really don't. And I think that that's the battle that we're up against right now. I think, yes, we can take on educating the community that this would be appropriate. But as far as this commission is concerned, I think if there are areas in the ordinance that need tightening up because we feel like there's too many loopholes or there's too much leeway or there's too much interpretation of the intention of those, if that's needed, that's where I think we should be centering our time right now, is looking at like, okay, what's wrong, what's broken, and how do we fix it? If there is anything broken. I don't know what the rest of the commission thinks.
Well,
you know.
I want to make a comment that my comments are really directed at architecture and look, not to reuse, green, sustainable. That's not our purview. That's not your purview. To the extent that those things apply, they should apply to the whole community, not to the resource management zone. And that's not your purview. Your purview is to make it look good, not to design, not to dictate someone's lifestyle needs to live in a rammed earth home. You can make a house that looks like a rammed earth home that's made out of sticks and stucco. So I think we have to get away from what what you're trying to accomplish. You're a board of architectural review, not a decider of lifestyle. But I think the things that fit in and look like they fit into that zone is totally within your purview. That's my opinion. And I think we're saying the same thing.
You're saying exactly what I'm saying.
Bob?
All I'm trying to do is preserve the hillsides. And by designing sustainably, you are preserving the hillsides.
I would make a
Much
distinction between using recycled
Well,
materials as really having
That's
nothing
not
to do with
appropriate. It has
architectural
nothing-
review.
It has nothing to do with the hillside. I agree with you on that. I'm just showing you things that are in the mix that are.
And if somebody wants to propose that, more power to them, but we're not dictating it. At least not from my perspective, we're not dictating it. Commissioner Overall.
At the risk of reiterating some things other people have said, but when I go back through the notes here, I see one page that I marked specifically was the definition of changing it from acreage to amount of buildable area. I think you have the latitude within the guidelines. FARs are not fixed in stone. But if some clarification on that would be helpful, that's a particular project that we could undertake. There's also, I think, what?
Get closer to your mic.
Okay, thank you, Mother. There's, in the area where you talked about the pools and the 16-foot setback, again, maybe that's something that needs some clarification, although in my personal judgment, you have the discretion for it. In the area where you're talking about design and materials and all that, if, as Tony asserted there are impediments in our guidelines that keep you from encouraging that kind of, then let's address those specifics and let's get those fixed. But and maybe we need more discussion between the MBAR and the MPC and the community about what these interpretations are, the latitude you have or don't have, and we need to narrow the width of discretion that you feel that you have, so that it doesn't, so it's not quite so broad. But I'd like to get down to some specifics that we can try and implement to help you. And I think I certainly agree with Chair Berrig and Commissioner Gottstanker. I think when we get into the materials that you use in architecture and what they, the specific designs of that, not the designs, but the forcing somebody lifestyle, I think was the word that was used. I would have trouble with that.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I get to agree with everyone. That's so nice. But I think in particular, Chairman Berrig, I think your statement is exactly right. If we can just focus more strongly on minimizing visual impact, the owner is going to have a choice between maybe no house, very small house, or one of those houses. And they may fall in love with that house to get a bigger house. And the community will appreciate it as well. And maybe the result isn't as dramatic as I first thought. So good point, Chairman.
From my perspective, the one issue that you brought up that I think could be really germane is the grading issue. That's one that I can see that it ties your hands to some extent. Because if you're trying to minimize grading, how do you do that in the context of reducing visual impacts? Because sometimes they're not compatible. That one might be one we need to really look at. Commissioner Gottsanger, you want to?
Yeah, I would suggest that grading probably is the issue that we should be looking at, period.
Yeah.
Whether it works for what they're suggesting or what needs to go on in the RMZ zone, I think grading is an issue. I think that's probably one of our major issues as to whether our guidelines, our development standards in our ordinances really fit what we're after as far as protecting the environment on steep slopes. I think this is the beginning. That's like, we need to deal with that one, and then we can go on and deal with anything else, because the major impact of, in my opinion, of everything that goes on in the RMZ zone that the community does not like, gets upset about, that MBAR has to deal with, starts with grading. You know, I mean, do you build a house on the existing pad that exists, or do you have the ability to push it out and do this and do all of this stuff? Do you have the ability to put in a road that anywhere in the hillsides, you know, that meets the fire department requirements of 16 feet, 20 feet, you know, that alone, just the putting in of a road destroys the whole intent of protecting resource management, in my opinion. Let me tell you, I mean, it's like a big deal. You know, the scarring that has happened happens because of grading. The scarring that happens up there happens because of the clearing of vegetation. You know, it just does. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the size of the house that goes on the pad afterwards. To some extent, it drives that, you know, but in some instances, it would make no difference what you put there once you got there. You know, so those are the issues that I think that we need to get clear about, is like, how do we strengthen the grading requirements as they are today in order to protect the resource management area? Because those 40 some odd lots that are undeveloped, they're going to need roads. How much grading is that going to require to get people to whatever site they may or may not have?
Director Black.
Mr. Chair, just 2 points. One is on the grading issue, and then the second is we haven't taken public comment yet.
Right.
So, but maybe before we do, I could just comment briefly on grading, and I'm not sure how we would address it differently if we chose to address it differently. The Hillside Mon development standards do in fact say project grading shall not exceed 1,500 cubic yards of cut or fill. But then there's all sorts of exceptions and findings, and the exceptions are unless it's necessary to allow reasonable development of the property or achieve reasonable vehicular access. And you can argue about what that means, because I think sometimes there are more than one development sites on these particular pieces of property, and you could choose a different development site and probably reduce vehicular access needs, but not always. And then it goes on to state that grading may exceed 1,500 cubic yards if the BAR can make all of the following findings: that the proposed grading respects the significant natural landforms of the site and blends with adjacent properties, that graded slopes relate to the natural contours of the site, that the length and height of retaining walls has been minimized to the extent feasible, which is very open, and that there are no others, and this is getting back to is there a better place to build on the site, that there are no other suitable alternative building sites available on the property that could be utilized. So I think the guidance that exists is actually pretty good, and it supports the position of planning and development that visual policies and grading policies really have to be looked at together. You can't say, you can't just make a decision that something's visually compatible and not look at grading and vice versa. So they really are balanced. So there is a lot there already.
So it wouldn't be inappropriate when a design came before Tony's group for them to say, we realize that you're saying you're restricted by the grading. We want you to put this house, we want you to depress this house because of its visual impact, and we'll give you more leeway on your grading in order to allow that to happen.
If they can make these findings. The other point I guess I would make is,
so could they say, this is how we'll let you build in this particular location? We want you to change the topography to depress this house.
I think they can, and I think they have.
Okay.
The other issue is, and I agree
So
with.
it's just a matter of us as a policy matter saying this is what we want you to do.
We need to balance all of those issues. The other thing is, I do agree with Commissioner Godstinker that it's often the road that is the most significant feature of the site, but it's not always just the road.
No,
And people are proposing very large houses in a zone district that intentionally does not include the word residential in it. It's
Well,
a resource management zone. So I don't want the commission to lose that thread that came from the staff's presentation earlier this morning, that it really was intended to be something different than an R1E1 zone. And so anyway, enough said.
Well, go ahead, Commissioner Gottsinger, but I
Yeah.
do want to take in our public comment. here.
Right. So I agree with everything that Diane has said here. What I think, at least for myself, the development standards in the architectural guidelines were written for the entire hillside overlay district, the entire. And so I find what her pointing to Mr. Langle's presentation of the RMZ zone. See, I personally think that given that we've got a resource management district, that what exists in the architectural guidelines and the development standards is fine for the entire district. But I personally think that we may need to up the ante when it comes to resource management district. And I think that we have, given that we're charged with protecting the resources, I think we have a pathway of getting there. That's, without necessarily having to change this document at all, which applies to all of the Hillside Overlay District. What I think I keep pointing to, now I'm hearing myself say this, is that in the land use ordinance, which we just made amendments to, we literally have a zone district that we can deal with as inside the ordinance. We can make amendments to that ordinance that really begin to address that district, not the entire whole Hillside Overlay District, just that part of it. That's kind of where the direction that I think that I'm going. Not everywhere, that district, resource management, and that we design grading standards to fit resource management. And that's a big job. I noticed the fire department was here earlier, Mr. Langhorn. We might need to deal with a whole lot of other agencies here. One of which being the requirements by the fire department to have 20-foot roads on slopes that are greater than 40%. How do you deal with that without majorly impacting the resources? So that's I see it as being a much bigger project than what we can resolve today, which is why I keep going back to let's just get a list of what's broken and then start there.
Well, I'm going to move us on to public comment, and I don't know if we have any speaker slips, but. Yes, we do. It's my job here. Mr. Tedesco, Ted. And I also have a speaker slip from Victoria Green, both representing the Montecito Association.
Thank you very much. My name is Ted Tedesco, and I'm chair of the Land Use Committee for the Montecito Association. I really want to, first of all, congratulate you and thank you for this topic and the hearing and the discussion that we've heard. I also want to thank the staff, who did a beautiful job of outlining all of the issues. I spent a number of hours doing this, only to find that, as usual, they were way ahead of me on it, and I could have saved myself a good bit of time trying to get myself through the layering and the laws and the policies and the guidelines that apply. But thank you all for taking the time on this issue. Hillside development is a serious issue to the Land Use Committee. It's one that we held a meeting on just last Monday. It's a growing concern. We see things that are happening. We see projects that are allowed or have allowed or in the process of being allowed that concern us greatly, because what we do is go back and read essentially the principles upon which we operate or view our community. And that itself leads us to conclude that maybe something isn't working, something isn't abiding by those principles that we want to live by, those community plans, those comprehensive plans that have been developed over the years, and allow us to have some confidence that our governmental entities and private initiatives are going to abide by those things. But something is happening as you stand on the corner of San Ysidro and East Valley Road, and you begin to look up at the hillside and south of that area, and you say that, well, all of these things seem to be right. And I believe that you are right about that. It's our conclusion, first of all, that not substantial, if any, law amendments or changes need to be made. I believe in reading this, there is a proper series that exists, starting with the county's plan and continuing on to the Montecito Community Plan, and then which essentially define the what for us as we read those. And then the hows tend to be the guidelines and all the other things that apply when and if. But our what is what is concerning us, because something isn't jibing with the basic principles that we believe in. And as we heard this morning, 51 private developments have allowed, and there's 61 to go, at least on the private parcels that are still available for some kind of use. That could turn the tide, if not properly done with the right attention, to really making that whole area, the whole intent, I suppose, of that zone and the concern for that zone to really swing the other way. And so that's why our growing concern and our interest and our study and review of that is almost in perfect parallel to what you people are doing. It's almost how did it all come together in this particular time and this particular week. So thank you for doing that. Here's the way we look at it, I think. There's a hierarchy of policies and plans that are more guiding, that give us what we live by, and those are the community plans and the languages that are in the Montecito Community Plan. And then we look to a lesser in significance, not importance, but in significance, to the application, the hillside and the development stuff, and what do you do about this and that, and how should it be guided and all of that. But Ms. Peugeot essentially rang the bell for me when she in a sense clarified better the task that you have, and MBAR, this applies to both, of course, that you have in trying to apply that. But from our point of view, there are the principal ones are the guiding ones to us. And sometimes I think maybe we're led to feel that as we try to apply the guidelines, we lose sight of what was our principle that got us into the guideline business anyway. And my experience seems to indicate that if a proponent who really wants to do something somewhat on the line they always pick up guidelines. You know, guideline seems to be the thing that allows them to focus everybody's attention so that suddenly a grading scar that everybody knows is going to be a scar becomes a debated issue as to what can be done and not done. And the fact of the matter is, when it's all said and done, it's a scar is a scar is a scar, and it will be there for a long time. Or you look at detailed landscaping plans that are never going to evolve over the next 25 years, but they look awfully good on paper, especially when they copious use of green pencil and all of that. You've been through all of that, and we think that that's a difficult, but you can almost see it coming. So I think that Mr. Phillips's discussion of intent is important. But if I were in your position, I would say my intent tends to be guided by the basic principles, the basic policy, the basic idea or notion or public statement in the comprehensive plan, in the Montecito principles and plans up front. Because when you read those and then you look at a project, there's a little more guidance to that, a little more substance insofar as the way I would look at it anyway. So one other point, because I had to change my notes a lot based on what I heard today. It was very good, and I was very pleased with what I heard and the level of discussion and the awareness on the county staff in particular, because I had not been privy to that in a long, long time. And so I'm very pleased to see that you people are involved in this for us. I hear an awful lot about how do you balance between the public and the interests of a private owner, a private developer, someone who's owned the property for a long time and now has the wherewithal, or through a sale is going to allow a parcel to be developed. I can only tell you, in my view, as a citizen who expects the government to, in a sense, set out and follow these kinds of principles, that there is a higher value put to community than there is to individual rights. That old dialogue and debate has gone on for many times, but it's, in my view, it's not equal. Community views and community character, history and development is persuasive to me rather than any one person's right to go in and do whatever they want within certain guidelines to their property. And while you want to be sensitive to it, there is a compelling need, in my view, that those are important things as community representatives. And when it is all said and done, I suppose visibility and scarring is what really drives the juice in a lot of people as to what is going on. Those are the principal ones. And supposedly, if you can tighten up those kinds of things, although I did read guidelines because I don't know how you could, but maybe there is something to do. But I think you've got the whole litany and the layering very well done. But it tends to be somewhat off kilter for something, because the result is not something that I think you or the government had in mind, the county and the appropriate agencies had in mind. Something is getting done, and therefore one has to look at it, I think, in a different or with a more strenuous view. I can only say that, yes, Montecito Association wants to work at public meetings. I appreciate Ms. Burrows' view that there is a role for us to play, and we're prepared to play that. We want to play that, and a lot more dialogue, a lot more information, I think could benefit us a great deal. And so we stand ready to help you. I'd also want to point out that Victoria, whom you all know, we asked her to prepare that material because it was very helpful to us, and I think Victoria also wants to make some comments, as well as maybe Bill Palladini, and Tony Harbour, who of course is our liaison to the Montecito MBAR, okay? But thank you very much, appreciate it.
Thank you for your comments.
Good afternoon. Victoria Green on behalf of the Montecito Association, and I'm going to repeat a little bit of what you've heard already, but I think it's really valuable. You know, I think everybody in this room realizes that there's some sort of problem, that something's not quite right with the development that we're getting and is being proposed on the hillsides in Montecito. So for us, you know, it's kind of take a step back. What's the solution? Well, what's the problem? And one of the exercises that my land use committee asked me to go through was, well, what are the regulations that govern this? And that's what led me to pull together the packet of information. And I think it's really useful to think of, as I think June said in some response to comments of Commissioner Gottstankers, that there's sort of this inverted triangle where you've got comprehensive plan policy on the top, and I think a couple of specific land use element policies about visual resources and hillside and watershed protection, grading, and protection of natural resources that are really key and sort of are the overarching policies that affect this whole discussion. Then you go into specifics in the Montecito Community Plan, onto the Land Use Development Code that sets out requirements for the resource management zone, the hillside overlay, and ridgeline and hillside design standards, and then on into the architectural guidelines. So everything in the guidelines, though it might be a little goes into detail, has a little more room for discretion, it flows from policies that are mandatory. You know, and I always loved these when I was on staff, but it just says so much. You know, in areas that are designated as rural, the height, scale, and design of structures shall be compatible with the character of the surrounding natural environment. You know, to me that seems really, really clear, and I think so much of what we're talking about today flows from that. When we talk about implementing review of development in these areas, you have two parties that are kind of responsible for an ultimate project approval. You have staff that's reviewing the project for consistency with the comprehensive plan and the Montecito Community Plan and compliance with zone district standards. And you have the Montecito MBAR, who's primarily focused on applying the architectural guidelines and making the related findings out of the Land Use Development Code. What they do is subject to review by your body and perhaps the Board of Supervisors when there is debate on issues and a project ends up being appealed. The thing I was reminded of as I was reading through the regulations and the policies that apply to hillside development is that they're really strong, they're really good. They should be getting you some of that development that Marcia showed you pictures of. That's what they speak to. But that's not what we're always getting, and I think the way that we get to that is for you to give clear direction to staff and to the MBAR in that you want to see those policies, those existing standards that were adopted through much community discussion, upheld. You know, and I think you do that in your words and then also in your actions when you see these projects on appeal. And the policies are really strong. Staff can't approve a land use permit if it is not consistent with the comprehensive plan. So in a rural area, not subordinate to the natural environment, it should be denied to come back, or the applicant should be directed to come back with something that meets that standard. It based on the written policies, the required findings for a land use permit, it shouldn't be approved. So I just want to say that I think those policies and standards give staff and your commission a lot of power, as well as the MBAR. Focusing on the problems and where do we need fixes, I don't see personally where we necessarily need fixes in the written standards. There are, I think, some problems that come up. You know, we have that FAR table in the hillside section of the Montecito Architectural Guidelines, which I think sends the wrong message to some people. I think it would be really valuable for you in this room, though, to acknowledge that that's just some information, and what really governs are all those policies of the comprehensive plan and the specific standards that are spelled out with respect to hillside development in the architectural guidelines as well as the zoning ordinance. The question of pre-existing development, I liked what I heard Commissioner Berg say. I think it was that the argument that I should be able to build what my neighbor did doesn't carry water, and I would like to hear your commission as a whole reaffirm that. I think Marcia was showing you some examples of development that was done in concert with the surrounding natural environment. You know, it'd be great to hear you say that you've read the policies that apply. Your understanding is that a project should be designed of materials and of a height and scale of development that is subordinate to that surrounding natural environment. One issue that I think is a little bit more technical and maybe warrants further discussion is how building height is calculated. I think that you have a situation where under the more recently adopted building height definitions, that if you lop off, say, the top of a knoll, you can build a taller structure than if you were to build on the existing grade, because building height is measured from that existing grade. So if my existing grade is here, but I'm going to grade down to here, I can have maybe a 26-foot building because I've cut 10 feet as opposed to what would have been a 16-foot tall building on top of that. So that's, I think, an area that's difficult to deal with, because you do want buildings to be cut into the slope as opposed to rising above, yet you don't want these hills lopped off so that you can have more structure on top of a knoll. And I think those are all my comments. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. They were really useful. Let's see, we have one more, which is Anthony Harbour.
Thank you. I'm Tony Harbour. I represent the Montecito Association. I'm the liaison at the MBAR meeting, so I've attended these meetings since January of this year. And I think that I'm going to enforce a lot of what has been said already today, that what we need to do is enforce the guidelines. They are not being enforced by staff or by the MBAR. And that's just my opinion, and I think that's the guidelines are very, very clear, but I think they need to be enforced further. They could be changed somewhat to come into a code issues instead of guidelines, which may be helpful based upon some of the things that have been said. So my concern is enforcement, and if we can do that, I think we'll end up with a better community for Montecito. And then one other issue that's been talked about is that Ted talked about was that we've had 50 buildings built in the mountain zone and we've got 60 more to build. And scarring is more of an issue than the building and everything else. You see now the scars, not the buildings. And I think that's an issue that should be taken up in a discussion between the Commission and the MBAR and the Montecito Association. I think would be a good idea for the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We have one more speaker slip, which is former member of this body, Bob McGrebland. LA member chair. So we'll only have to discount your comment, not as much as
Thank you, Chairman. And Commissioners, I'm Bob McGrebland. First, I'd like to compliment Noel on his presentation and also compliment the Commission on the quality of its discussion. I was very impressed with the issues that were raised and the way they were discussed. I have only a couple of rather focused remarks to make. The more general remarks have already been made, and they're very desirable and I think useful. We have to remind ourselves that the guidelines were created because of problems on the hillside. And these are problems which the public observes, and they're visual. That's why there's an observation. That's why there's a complaint. It involves either scarring of the hillside or the architecture that's put up there, or the imposition of the architecture. Insofar as the visual impact is concerned, I think Commissioner Gottstanker said it well, that you have to consider the compatibility of the project with the total environment, not just the buildings next door. That tends to be more important in the urban area, but not so much in this larger expanse, which is visible to a larger population. There is a tendency always to look at the adjoining properties or the nearby properties and use them as a precedent. to argue for your case that mine is no bigger or no more conspicuous than the ones that have already been made. Some of them were made long before the guidelines came into existence, but unfortunately some of them have been made since then. And I think what you have to avoid, and I direct this comment to the Montecito Board of Architectural Review, that you have to avoid the ratcheting effect. The instant you propose something that's conspicuous or beyond the guidelines, you then give an opportunity for the next candidate, the next applicant, to make the same argument or to use that as a foundation. That, in effect, diminishes the guidelines and makes it inoperative and not useful. So I think it's important that you stay with the guidelines and impose them as well as you can. The comment was made that the grading ordinance and standard is the important, most critical component of this entire matter. I think what has been read out to remind us that the grading standards are already quite adequate. They're quite flexible, in fact. And the only thing that's required is that they be applied with good judgment. But there's plenty of flexibility if you need it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bill Palladini.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Just have a few brief comments. As president of the association, I think it's fair for me to express the community's concern about this issue. I wrote a brief part of my column in the Montecito Journal about a month ago on this issue, what's going on with the hillsides, and it elicited quite a response in the community, which to me communicates people's growing concern about the ever-increasing and more visible development in the hillside. Following up on that, what's really amazing, I think using the word profound may be appropriate here, that if one sits and reads what the guidelines and the standards and the community plan says about this issue, it's really quite amazing how clearly spelled out it already is as to what the guidelines, and those people who came before us and created these documents really understood the issues, and I can't believe that somehow today that those issues have not, in fact, dramatically changed. I think they're very much the same concerns, if not increasingly so. The last thing I would say, following up on Commissioner Burrow's suggestion, is that I would like to offer the resources of the Montecito Association to participate in a community discussion or further community discussion about this issue, perhaps with the MBAR, perhaps with planning staff, and to the extent that those of us in the community and yourselves feels that's necessary, we'd be very happy to offer our resources for the benefit of the community to do that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. If no one else wishes to address us, I'm going to close the public comment period. And before we do anything else, I want to thank everyone for their participation here. I thought this was one of the most useful policy discussions I've ever sat through here in this body. But I'll put it back to my commissioners for any comments you want to make. I have some real strong opinions about this, but I'll hold them for a while. I bet you all do. Commissioner Overall.
I have just two comments I wanted to make. I think a lot has been said. I don't know that there's a complete consensus in the room as to the adequacy of the guidelines and the other documents that govern this. But Mr. Palladini spoke about the clarity, as did others. And yet I think it's clear that from the MBAR standpoint, it must not be quite as obvious to them as it is to us. Because if in fact the problem is one of implementation and applying, there seem to be some difficulties there. And I think we need a further discussion with the members of the MBAR to really completely understand the problem from your perspective. So that would be my first and perhaps most important comment. The second one I wanted to make, we've talked about grading and we've talked about scoring. living in an area up in Oak Creek Canyon, which is affected by this, I just want to personally reiterate, there is a home that's up above me that some people have told me was single-handedly responsible for the adoption of the Ridgeline and Hillside Overlay District in Montecito. It's been there probably for 30 years.
47, it was built in 1947.
Thank you. It is still scarred. I mean, it hasn't been mitigated at all since 1947. It's undoable once you cut into these hillsides, and I see a progression of it going directly to the east from me, which apparently the MBAR has limited ability to directly affect in the new development there. But there are scars being generated there that the community is going to have to live with forever. So I think that is the area from my personal perspective that I would like to see the most attention paid to. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by apologizing to MBAR for my impatience. I really wasn't clear where we were going. I do see that this was a very valuable discussion. I think unlike my colleague, Commissioner Overall, I do, and I also do understand the problems you are having. I'm not sure what I heard today would support traditional building in that zone. I don't know that it can be done. I don't know how you can legally grant someone the right to build a home and not have a road to get there. I don't know how you do that without scarring, without a 20-foot fire requirement. And I also don't know what subordinates to surrounding natural environment exactly means. Some of the examples you provided, I think, support that. I can see that. But, you know, we still live in a land of laws, and people rely on their government to speak clearly. How do I buy a piece of property and have this sense of, and have no sense at all what I can build there? It's a problem. I mean, it's a real problem. I agree with my colleague Commissioner Gottsdenker that we should not legislate lifestyle. I mean, that's a huge mistake. We never want to go there. But I see this as a much more complicated issue than I think some. Again, I apologize for my impatience. I think it was an excellent presentation and raising significant issues, and that we should proceed. Again, I think it's I don't know how we get to a resolve here, but I think we're on our way, perhaps. Thanks.
Anyone else? Commissioner Burrows.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you from the MBAR for the presentation that you made today. You gave me a lot of information that is useful. I want to thank the Montecito Association for addressing these issues, and Victoria for gathering the material that we have. It's interesting, as I listened to the presentations today, I was taken back to 1991 when we had the election for cityhood. And those of us on the slate that were elected to the city council were elected on one straight statement. That statement was keeping Montecito rural. And it seems to me that as we have evolved and as we have made the community plans and all the ordinances and guidelines that we have now, that still is our focus. And so it seems that sometimes the more that things change, the more they remain the same. But I think our focus is the same. I think the people in Montecito still want to keep it semi-rural. We want to protect the beautiful place that we have. And I thank all of you for the help that you have given us in that.
Thank you. Claire, do you want to make any final?
I think so.
How many pages of notes do you have there?
I only have actually half a page of notes. I have lots more notes, but I
Okay,
have
well,
a
we
half
got,
a
we
page
got the
of
timer on you.
right here. Okay, so I want to point out that I actually am limiting my comments to the RMZ zone. Not the entire Hillside Overlay District, just to the RMZ zone. And these are areas that I think it would be possible for us to look at that would be intended to strengthen the ordinance with regards to the RMZ zone and to get at some of the issues that have come up today. Okay, so I think we should look at have some discussions with those people who, and essentially the Montecito Fire District, to possibly look at the reduction of the widths of road needed to get to buildings in that area. Okay, that's one possible way of getting at the scarring. When I did my subdivision that I've referred to several, just so anybody in the room that was not aware of why I'm here today, it all had to do with doing the subdivision of the 98 acres that I did on West Mountain Drive. That's why I'm a planning commissioner today. Up until that point in time, I had literally no interest in land use. I got real interested real fast. So, and it happens to be in the RMZ 40 zone district. So I'm very familiar with all of this. So because in my case, when those roads were built, we negotiated down to 14 feet wide. It wasn't, the requirement was 20 through much negotiation because the 8 owners of that property were committed to protecting the environment. We negotiated down to 14. So I'm suggesting that possibly needs to be maybe a public negotiation, okay? That then, in instances that I can think of, where roads have been allowed, that scarring has happened, there literally have been other areas on the 40 acres that have, yes, it's not where the homeowner wanted to build, it's not where the applicant wants to build, but we do have in our Hillside Overlay District rules and regulations that says if you got an alternate site, you got to go there. And we have done that in the past in Montecito. We have taken some of these big parcels where they wanted to go up the top. We said, no, you're going down there, and we've forced them to go down there. So that's inside of the enforcement that people have been referring to. Then another issue that came up was that was brought up by Marcia, and I think it's really a reasonable issue to begin to look at inside the RMZ zone, which is to reduce the FAR standards to being compared to the buildable area. We don't have to touch any of the other guidelines that way. We don't have to change any language in the guidelines. We just deal in this district and say, this is your buildable area. This is what you're allowed on this buildable area. Something in that direction. I think Ms. Green, Victoria Green's comments on measured from existing grade, yeah, I think we're going to get it. I think we might want to look at going back in that zone district only to measuring from existing grade, not going to where we have gone. Yep, I think that's it. Those are ones that I see right now, that we possibly could deal with all of that inside the RMZ zone district.
Thank you, Commissioner Gotstinger. I think your comments are really good. In fact, I think all of the Planning Commission's comments here. I really, going back to our public comment, I thought Victoria Green did a great job of stating something that was followed up by Robert McGreblian and Bill Palladini, which is, we have guidelines and policies in place, and I think that's what you're saying. For the most part, what we're talking about here is refocusing ourselves on what our policies are. And I think like all things, well, maybe not like all things, but obviously in this case, our enforcement of our own policies has sort of maybe not been quite as good as it could have been. And I think what we're really looking now is at enforcing the policies we already have in place. And it's just a matter of focusing our attention and frankly a matter of giving our MBAR guidelines that the fact that we previously didn't focus on these issues doesn't mean that we can't now. And I think we should, the message I think I'm hearing from my fellow commissioners is yes, we'd like you to start enforcing the guidelines that we have in front of us already in place, and maybe with some amendments. You know, and the association talked about maybe having some further discussion to make sure that we understand within the range of where we've been, where we might want to try to be going with this. But I'm hearing a general consensus that we need to cut this back and focus more on putting the houses in the appropriate places on the lot, making sure that they're correctly set back into the lot, and just simply enforcing the policies that we already have in place. And the fact that we didn't do it in the past doesn't mean that we can't do it now. We're not bound by that. And I think you feel uncomfortable that you're bound by it, and I don't think you are. I see you want to make another comment.
Well, I actually wanted to just add to what you said, you know, is that I think that if we say that we have strong enough policies, both in the comprehensive plan and in the Montecito community plan and in the development standards and architectural guidelines, then I would like to have some future report from staff as to why they have been unable to support or what issues have come up for staff that they have not been able to hold people to, what's missing in all of that document that you literally have not been able to hold people to account for building inside those regulations. You know, I mean, we're asking MBAR to do that. It comes to us at some point. Why doesn't, when an application comes in, why doesn't staff doesn't say, no, you can't do that. Sorry, it's in the ordinance, it's in the comprehensive plan, it's in the Montecito community plan. Then if something's missing that staff can't support those documents, then I'd like to know what's missing for staff, that they can't say no. They're the first line, that's the application comes to them far before it comes to any of us. You know? So there's gotta be something missing somewhere that allows these things to happen inside the documents that we've got.
Well, hopefully we're adding that ingredient today, that little bit of catalyst. Commissioner Phillips.
Mr. Chair, and I may be wrong, but I think for the record, it should be recognized that we have never, this commission has never approved a home in the resource management zone in the 5 years we've been here. Isn't that true? I don't think we have.
I don't think we've approved one yet.
So when it's said that we've made mistakes in the past, I'd like to be excluded from that.
Oh, got it.
All right, I appreciate that, and I think, you know, I understand your comments directed back to staff, but we are, in fact, that's why we're here, is to give staff that input, and that things do evolve and change over time.
Well, I understand, but the thing is by the time an application comes in, Mr. Chairman,
I'm making
and then
a
it goes,
decision
and then
between how it
staff
has
makes its whole, whatever staff says about it, and then it it goes to MBAR. It may, as far as Commissioner Phillips has pointed out, may never get to us. It may never get to us at all, ever. There's no, you know, in fact, one of the things that I wrote down that I didn't bring up here was move the review of all projects in the RMZ zone to the PC. Just move them. Make it like a coastal development permit. It's got to come here. We got to see it. You know, if MBAR doesn't feel that they have the tools to get a project going in that direction, if staff, and that's why I said that there's something, if staff doesn't have the tools to say, no, we don't want that kind of building, we don't want that kind of scarring, we don't want that kind of road. If staff doesn't feel they can do it and MBAR doesn't have to do it, then have us review all those. Just make it like a coastal development permit. That's one pathway that it could, where, then the buck stops here, which is what you're saying right now, Commissioner, that this is where it should stop.
That's where it should
Then, okay, then let's put that in. All resource management zone districts have to come to the Planning Commission. And we get to say no. I don't care who says no, but what I'm hearing is that the different boards, MBAR, say they don't have the tools to do it. I don't think staff hasn't weighed in, but they haven't been doing it. So where does it get done? That's what the community's asking. Where does it get done? Who upholds these documents?
Mr. Chair?
Commissioner Phillips.
I think we shouldn't forget that we're all dealing with a very fine line, and cross it and you have a taking issue. And I think your suggestions will help everyone. That's always there. And this is serious money, and it's, people's lives. So and the tighter these regulations are, guidelines, I think the better for all of us. And I think we're going to have less problems if we can get some of those things implemented.
Well, that's why in the wording of almost every one of the documents that we heard today, it says maximum extent feasible. That's what stops the taking. That's what gets it out of black and white and takes it into a discretion or a consideration or whatever we want to call it,
But your feasible may be different than someone else's.
That's right, it is, but I think that's probably what's unclear here, is the maximum extent feasible. And I think we have to be responsible for getting that more clear.
Commissioner Burrows. Oh, did you?
My comment was covered, thank you.
Well, I really appreciate all the discussion. Does staff want to make any comments back to us, or do you want to let it sit? I do think that there's only 60 parcels left in that zone. And maybe the suggestion that we see each one of them is not a bad idea. We can do it anyway. We get the agendas. We know every time one comes in from the MBAR.
But we cannot comment at MBAR.
Tis
See,
true.
that's the problem. That's what the breakdown that happens, is that I, as a planning commission, who have spent the last 25 years of my life trying to protect the hillsides, cannot go in and comment to where I think that MBAR is not doing or doing whatever. I can't do that. So, which is what drives it to pushing it here, so that I actually do have something to say about it. And I can do that in a public arena. But I have been called to task more than a few times by various members of both staff and county council about commenting to MBAR. So I don't do it anymore.
It is a legitimate point. I'm going to send it back to you, Director Black.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to make a comment. I'm not quite sure how I feel about whether the Planning Commission should or shouldn't review every one of these, but if the commission and ultimately the Board of Supervisors decided you should, I think it should be specified in the ordinance. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be just providing comments to the BAR. Interestingly enough, and we're not exactly sure why this is, in other RMZ zone districts throughout the county, all development is subject to a development permit, a development plan, which requires Planning Commission action.
It would come to us.
So in Montecito, it wasn't structured that way. Don't really exactly know why, but in the other zone districts it was throughout the county.
Would it be possible to find out why?
We can look into it and see if we can figure it out. I think it just was a choice in Montecito.
Could it be the same, is it handled the same way for road construction, which I think is
It's development.
any development,
anything
including
that triggers development.
Right.
And the other point and that I think is important is, some of the development that we see in RMZ, we're probably going to see no matter who looks at it, because these parcels are extremely constrained, and there will be a point where you've got to approve something, and it may not be the most visibly pleasing thing because of the way the lots are configured. So I think that was a really good acknowledgement. It's difficult dealing with this. So
I think for all of us, I'd appreciate you doing some research on that subject and seeing if we couldn't come back. And one last thing, Mr. Spann, do you want to make any last comments based on what's come up? Okay. If there's nothing else, I'm going to close us out. And I thought this was a great discussion, and hope we've made some progress towards, if nothing else, at least giving the MBAR the benefit of where we would like to see you go on. So, any other matters before us? If not, we're adjourned.
And we'll see you next week.
We'll
Special meeting.
next week.
Great.